Welcome, commissioners and the public that are joining us today. This is the November 14th meeting of the Oregon Climate Action Commission. And we will be hearing a number of topics today. So if someone can share the video or the slide deck. Oh, great. Before we go there, just to remind folks of how to use WebEx. If you're new to using WebEx for meetings, Jen, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide and describe that.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to those who are new. As always, we will be using WebEx for the meeting. On the left are your audio and video controls. Please keep your microphone muted when you are not speaking, and you may turn on your camera if you're able to. At the bottom of the meeting window, you'll find the reaction such as a hand icon to raise your hand and the option to lower it once done. The chat feature on the right allows you to send messages to everyone. Please keep in mind that the public will be able to see those messages and that the meeting recording will be uploaded to YouTube after the meeting. Thank you.
And also just if you have raised your hand, sometimes it's not easy in this format to see raised hands. So if you're commissioner, go ahead and speak when you'd like. Hand raising is helpful, but sometimes it doesn't work perfectly on WebEx. With that, we'll go to just mention one update I wanted to mention was a new executive order that the governor put out a week or so ago, and it is focused on climate resilience and actions that the state can take collectively to improve the resilience of Oregon's ecosystems and communities. So excited to see that. We do anticipate that we'll be setting some time aside in January to learn about the executive orders that the governor is putting out relative to climate change in January. So looking forward to hearing more about those two executive orders then. Today we're going to be talking about the Oregon Energy Strategy and then focusing the bulk of the meeting on our National Climate Solutions deliverables. We'll be taking public comments and talking about next steps at the end of the meeting. So with that, I'm not sure if I've seen Edith yet. Is Edith on, Jeff?
Chair McDonald, Edith will be joining the call at 9:15 this morning.
Okay.
But we also wanted to do an introduction of a new ODO staff person, Jamshed.
Oh, great. Yeah. So, go ahead.
And I don't. Hi, everybody. Jamshed Santo here. New to ODO. I just joined last month. I'm joining as the climate lead within the planning and innovation division here. Prior to joining Odo, worked at the U.S. Department of Energy, where I was attorney, focusing on a whole range of things, but primarily on the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act and Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Prior to that, I had a number of positions unrelated to the climate and energy sphere. I was working in national security. I did some policy work at the White House, and then a number of other federal government positions. So excited to be here, excited to work with all of you. I appreciate the time.
Yes, we're very happy to have you. So I'm glad you're with us today. Are there any other updates that people want to share? Janine, Director Benner, excuse me, do you want to go ahead and just reference some of the implementation steps that are happening in response to the renewable energy executive order that came out last month?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Chair McDonald. I think I'm just stalling while we're waiting for Edith to get on, because the real exciting part of the Odo update is our energy strategy. But I did want to let folks know, because I know there's interest in the previous executive order that the governor issued back in October, Executive Order 25-25, accelerating wind and solar energy development in advance of elimination of federal clean energy tax credits. So that executive order had some directives to the Oregon Department of Energy and the Energy Facility Siting Council to do what we can within our existing authorities to help developers get their projects over the finish line in time to take advantage of tax credits that are going to be expiring. So there's not a whole lot to report yet, but I did want to let folks know one of the first parts of the executive order asks for us to consult with solar and wind projects. So we have done that. We've reached out and we've been in conversation with developers who have projects that are currently before the Energy Facility Siting Council or will be coming to us soon. And we've talked with them about the status of their projects and are working with them on whether and what changes or tweaks could be made to our existing timeline to help. And so nothing really big to report on that right now, but we are in touch with folks, and it seems like there are a few projects, but not that many that we may be able to adjust our process for. So happy to share more in January in terms of implementation.
Thanks, Dr. Benner. And folks that have been on the commission will recall that in August we got a presentation from the U.S. Climate Alliance, and the whole issue of how to accelerate projects came up at that meeting. And I think this the executive order and the response from Odo really speak to trying to address one of the concerns that was raised to us about the need to accelerate implementation of renewable energy projects to make it in as many in prior to the end of the incentive payments and funding. So it's great to see action on that. It was great to see the executive order last month, and I'm glad to hear that some work is going ahead on that front. So thank you for the leadership you have shown, and the governor's office leadership as well.
I'll just add, Kathy, because I think we have another 3 minutes before Edith starts, but we've talked with this group before about some actions that we're calling for in the energy strategy related to this topic. So not to get ahead of Edith, but as she's talking, and I'll put the link to the energy strategy in the chat, there are 2 actions that I'll just highlight under the electricity action section. One is action number 3, and that's review and share key findings with the legislature regarding near-term transmission needs and opportunities, and identify opportunities for the state to support transmission. Odo would lead this work and build on it to inform the role that a state transmission entity may play in enabling investment. So really highlighting the importance of transmission. And then another one is Electricity Action 5, and that is to conduct a study on barriers preventing construction and interconnection of permitted projects and recommend actions to overcome those barriers. So this is those 3 gigawatts of projects that have their site certificates through FSEC but haven't yet begun construction. So there, I just wanted to highlight that as an acknowledgement that these are topics that are of interest. And also the Department of Energy and the Governor's Office with some partners are looking at potentially submitting an application to the National Governors Association to take advantage of some technical assistance to help get a head start on pursuing those 2 actions. So stay tuned on that should we win.
Love to hear. Other commissioners want to have any updates to share? Mhm. Okay, well, then let's go to the Oregon Energy Strategy. Looks like Edith is with us now. Can I turn it over to you, Edith?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And really excited to be able to talk about the Oregon Energy Strategy, which I think, as you all know by now, was released on Monday. So I have some slides that I think are in this kind of master slide deck. So I'm just gonna kind of do the next slide prompts here. We don't have very much time because I know that you have a packed agenda. So what I'm going to do is try to give you the bit of a roadmap and a bit of orientation on what's what, since it's quite a long document, and I imagine not everyone has had time to look at it. So I'll try to highlight some of the key things in the energy strategy. But I'm also going to provide a little bit of a refresher on some of the context, some of which is in the energy strategy, just to bring us all along. So if we go to the next slide, and then the one after that. So as a reminder, Odo undertook development of the strategy following passage of House Bill 3630 in the 2023 legislative session, and we were asked to identify pathways to achieve the state's energy policy objectives. The question was not whether we could meet those objectives, it was really how we could do it, taking into account energy demand and trends, energy burden and affordability, natural resource impacts, and various other factors that are laid out in the statute. As I think I might have spoken to you all about before, the legislation was also not specific as to what the state's energy policy objectives are. We have a lot of objectives, and that's actually one of the main reasons why we have to do the strategy. So after consultation with other state agencies, experts, interested parties, Odo determined that the key clean energy policy drivers include statutory and regulatory directives like House Bill 2021, the Climate Protection Program, and Executive Order 2004. We also considered affordability and reliability as essential energy policy objectives. And as you see here, the bill also directed us to recommend legislation or changes to policy. And you'll see we have 42 actions that kind of fulfill that direction. And to develop the strategy through a robust engagement. And we have online, in the report, we reflect that engagement, but also online, if anybody's interested, we have all of the written comments that we received on the draft strategy, as well as a comment compilation that kind of summarizes those comments in a little bit more digestible format. Okay, if we go to the next slide. I think it's worth talking about why an energy strategy, because I feel like this is almost evolved while we've been developing the strategy. So on the right are some points that I think you've already heard us talk about, which is, we want to align policies. We want to understand different technologies and approaches and trade-offs. So that was part of what we were doing in the energy strategy, and have that opportunity to do that evaluation, focusing on affordability, on economic development, on equity, and on maximizing benefits and minimizing harms. But here on the left are some of the things that we've been seeing have been really front and center throughout the development. And that's, starting point is a diverse policy landscape, but we see huge demand growth driving really a historic investment cycle, particularly in the electricity sector. We see growing risk from wildfires and extreme weather putting pressure on the system at the same time that we're trying to figure out how we meet our goals and how we meet those demands. And there's also capturing the opportunity of new technologies. So we've seen a lot of increase in the uptakes of electric vehicles and heat pumps, for example. So if we go to the next slide, and we elaborate on these points more in the strategy. So you'll remember we undertook an evaluation to help inform what those different options are to meet our energy policy objectives. So this is a refresher, and I don't have many slides on the modeling, but I think it's useful to bring us back here because it kind of explains why the strategy says what it says. So you might remember, unlike studies that model emissions levels associated with different scenarios, the energy strategy reference scenario was structured to help understand what a least cost pathway to achieving Oregon's goals might look like. It incorporated high levels of demand side energy efficiency measures and electrification of end uses. That decision was informed by robust engagement, and it was based on an evaluation of least cost actions identified in numerous other energy transition studies. And then we tested that out with other scenarios. So even in the reference, I just want to add, with high levels of electrification, we don't assume 100% electrification. The model was designed to, in any sector, the model was designed to increase sales shares of electric technologies over time as vehicles are replaced, as equipment and appliances are purchased. So that's how this was structured. We modeled 6 scenarios and 3 sensitivities in total. And everything, all of them met our goals, but in different ways. So each scenario adjusted a key element to understand the effects of that adjustment compared to the reference on the broader energy system. And the scenarios were informed, again, by public engagement, and they included things like, what if we rely more on distributed resources? What if we limited in-state generation additions and relied more on imports for electricity? And then we also tested those assumptions on high levels of efficiency and electrification. So what if we delay building efficiency and electrification? What if we delay electric or vehicle electrification? And so what you see here are the economy-wide costs of those different scenarios compared to the reference. The reference is the black line. And as you can see, the other scenarios significantly increase costs over time. This is in billions of dollars that are hitting our pocketbooks. So this gave us pretty strong directional insight. Next slide. So here's a snapshot of the two key takeaways that I think are important to keep in mind, again, when we think about what the recommendations are in the energy strategy. So on the left, you have energy demand, not just electricity, energy by fuel. These are all the sources of energy that power our daily lives and economy, including electricity, gasoline, diesel, pipeline gas, and other sources. And as we go towards 2050 in 5-year increments, you can see 2 things happening. The bars are getting lower, and that's because energy demand is dropping, which is pretty incredible when you consider that this includes pretty aggressive assumptions on data center growth and other population and economic growth in Oregon between now and 2050. And the model still finds that a 22% reduction in energy demand. That's essentially a smaller energy sector supporting a bigger economy, and it's largely due to energy efficiency and electrification. But there's also, second takeaway, a 50% increase in, or a doubling, of electricity demand. So energy demand going down, but electricity demand growing. And that's for a few reasons. In the next 5 years, it's really data centers leading that growth. And then around 2030, we see electric vehicles ramping up and increasing electricity demand along with other drivers, including continuing data center demand growth. So this slide really emphasizes both kind of that opportunity of we can do more with a smaller energy system, but also the challenge of the building out that electricity sector. So next slide. I also wanted to include one more, and this is the last slide from the modeling, but we've often received the question throughout the process and leading up to it, how much do we need to build in Oregon and how much land area will that take? So we asked our consultants to evaluate the land area required for utility scale solar and wind development in Oregon specifically, since they have the largest footprint of resources that we see getting built, which is not to say the other resources don't have an important footprint as well. So it's important just to say that wind takes up much more land area because the way that this is calculated, this is based on NREL's data. This area required for wind includes the wingspan of the turbines and the spacing between them. So the impact on the ground is much less than what you see here. Whereas solar PV takes up much less land, but has much more complete ground cover. And that's nothing new for you, but I think it's worth just reminding us when we look at this slide. And you can see here that under the reference case, which is the least cost path we modeled, it shows a little over 300 square miles already being used today for solar and wind, and going up to a little over 600 square miles in 2035 and 800 in 2050. This doesn't give you the scale relative to Oregon's land area. So this is significantly less than 0.1% of Oregon's total land area. It's about 0.008%. It's significant. I'm not saying that that number doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It does very much. But we hope that by providing this kind of sense of scale, it can help inform conversations, to help advance solutions, to think through how we responsibly both meet our electricity needs and be responsible stewards of our natural and working lands. Okay, next slide. I'm going to have to speed it up. I tend to get really wordy. I get excited about the energy strategy. So, okay, turning to the recommendations. The modeling was about the what. That's why I wanted to talk about it. So the recommendations are about the how. How do we meet our clean energy objectives? This section of the report that has the strategy that includes 3 parts, pathways, policies, and actions, is in part Roman numeral 2, just to orient you. And there are these 3 levels of recommendations. There are 5 pathways to guide decision-making. Each pathway is broken into 3 to 4 high-level policies to refine that guidance. And then there are 42 legislative and policy actions focused on the next 4 years. So if we go to the next slide, these are the 5 pathways that we have written into the final report. And they're all meant to be advanced in parallel. This is not an order of sequencing or of priority. These are all important and need to happen really at once in parallel to each other. So energy efficiency is the cheapest, cleanest, least harmful energy because it's the energy that we don't use. So there's an emphasis on energy efficiency. Clean electricity has actually moved up. We switched the orders of clean electricity and electrification. Some of you might have caught that. Again, this is not an order of priority, but there's just so much concern right now over reliability that we wanted to just make the point that we recognize the need to build out that infrastructure. And that goes hand in hand as well with electrification and with having those electrons to support efficient electric end uses. And then we have, and for electrification, I just want to emphasize that we have a focus on strategic electrification. So really, this isn't something that happens overnight. It's something that's going to happen over the next couple of decades, and we need to be really conscious and thoughtful about how we electrify to maintain affordability, maintain reliability as we go. Low carbon fuels continue to play a really important role over time. They need to decarbonize to meet our goals. And there's a particular emphasis on the hardest to electrify sectors. And then resilience is just paramount in everything that we're doing in the energy system. We see increasing pressures from climate change, increasing pressures from extreme weather. And so as we invest in our energy system, we need to consider where we can both move towards cleaner sources of energy, but also which measures can also help us advance resilience, things like PV and storage, or weatherization along with heat pumps to help keep a building cool while protecting from poor air quality during wildfire season. Okay, next slide, please. In the throughout the energy strategy process, we had pretty robust engagement. Many of you were involved in working groups or the advisory group for the energy strategy, and we heard a lot about the benefits, and we also heard a lot of risks and barriers. And this is something that we worked really hard to capture in the report. So in the pathways and policies section of the report, you'll see this section on risks and barriers that I really want to draw your attention to, because it's where there's this recognition of both the benefits. So here's the example of strategic electrification, where we see this contributes to a significantly smaller overall energy system that leads to economy-wide savings, and those economy-wide savings result in savings in our pocketbooks. We see lower fueling costs for households when we're talking about electric vehicles, access to efficient air conditioning and heating. Air conditioning is increasingly important with rising temperatures, improved air quality from that shift, particularly in transportation to zero emission vehicles, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and financial savings for most. At the same time, we need to recognize that this is not going to be easy, and that there is some problem solving that needs to happen. So on the risks and barriers side, we know that we have a constrained electricity system right now with really strong demand growth. Heat pumps are more expensive for some households. This is something that we evaluated in our energy wallet analysis. And heat pumps also may require additional measures like weatherization to work well. And we see that particularly in low and moderate income households. And that is an example of where some of the information we're hearing is helping us think through where to focus policy. We also know that there are technology limitations in commercial and industrial sectors, as well as in heavy duty transportation. And then we also have the challenge of repurposing or disinvestment in pipeline infrastructure. So if we're talking about electrification, we start to talk about the need to coordinate between the gas and electricity sectors and to address this question. If we go to the next slide, I'm almost finished here. So this is, again, this is a flyby, so I'm happy to come back and do a more in-depth presentation if that's useful at some point. The energy strategy presents 42 near-term actions for consideration by the governor's office, by legislators, and other state agencies. We present those actions by sector. We start with cross-cutting actions. Then we talk about transportation, buildings, industry, electricity, and fuels. And there's a bit of a kind of vision statement at the start of each of those sectors that helps set the stage and also reflect some of the discussions we've had in public forums. And here you can see on the bottom right, what's the next step in the energy strategy? Well, some actions will involve agencies acting within their authority and resources. In other cases, implementation may require legislation to support agency resources or to create new programs, policies, or authorities. Next slide. We have a section in the report that was not there in the draft that I want to point you to. It's a section called Implementing the Energy Strategy. It talks about what I just talked about on the previous slide of, what are the next steps? Well, the next steps depend. They depend for each action on how that action can be taken forward. But in addition, we saw that there are some topics that have just grown in urgency during the development of the energy strategy. And so we highlight these 3 near-term priority areas: reliability and resilience, affordability and access to clean technologies, and what are the first steps that can be taken with minimal impact on the state budget. So given that we have this constraint on the state budget, what can we do now and what might need to wait? And so we pulled some of those 42 actions into this section to say, here's where we may want to prioritize first steps because of the urgency of these areas and because of that constraint on the state budget. We go to the next slide. So I also want to emphasize that there's a section that reflects feedback and themes that we heard from tribal engagement. This is not a reflection of the views of any of the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, but it is meant to summarize what we heard as Odo and points that we think are really important to keep in mind when implementing this energy strategy, and considering how to engage tribes and what some of those priorities that we heard are that surfaced during the energy strategies development. Go to the next slide. Also related to implementation, we have an equity and justice framework that outlines 6 approaches for decision makers. And I would say decision makers broadly, I would say anybody involved in this space, to consider that advance meaningful involvement and equity when crafting and implementing energy policy. And so we really, this equity and justice framework is framed up in a way that you can print it out separately. And we really would love to see this helping to inform the thought process, helping to guide kind of thoughts of how to involve different groups. When thinking about establishing programs, how to make sure that those programs do reach a broad set of Oregonians and make sure that they're serving low-income, vulnerable other communities who traditionally may have been left behind. Okay, next slide, please. This is the last slide, and I just want to point out that we have a landing page for the energy strategy that we're really excited about. It's you can link to it from our main website, but this is meant to be a way to explore the energy strategy in a more interactive way. So you can click on the thing that you're interested in and kind of go down that rabbit hole rather than having to open a PDF and find your way in that PDF. We also anticipate building this out over time. So we're hoping to build on this website to make it a resource moving forward on both what the energy strategy recommends, but also implementing the energy strategy. So thanks again for the time. I'm happy if we have time to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ida. That was a great rapid fire presentation. We probably got a little bit of time to take some questions. Your questions for Ida? A question I had was, what assumption did you make in the rate of data center growth?
Mm-hmm. So we, oh, sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the full question.
Yeah, no, that was the question.
We adopted the Power Council's mid-high data center forecast. Originally, we actually consulted this when we were having our kind of working group meetings for the modeling, and our advisory group was meeting. We started off with a lower growth scenario, and there was pretty strong concern that might not capture the scale of the challenge. So this was the council's 2029 resource adequacy forecast. So up to 2030, we applied a council's forecast, and then after that, we built in a 1.5% increase in demand driven by data centers, because there's really not enough data about what's going to come after 2030. So that was how we accounted for data centers over time.
Thank you. Commissioner Boston. I had this down last time.
Washington.
John W.
Yeah, John W. is fine.
I almost got it out.
Yeah, it's a lot in the mouth, so, well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate the Odo team. It's a really amazing report, really valuable. I'm a practitioner at the local level working on a climate plan. So this actually offers us a lot of really helpful information on how we can structure local activities to support the state energy strategy. And, from that perspective and from the perspective as an Oregonian, I want to thank you for it. My question was really more related to, I'm sure you're tracking the Lawrence Berkeley report that came out recently that examined rate drivers, nationally, and the finding there really showed that the investments in the distribution system, in part driven by an aging system, in part driven by, wildfire risk or hurricane risk, as it may be, depending on your geography, is one of the key drivers. So it's not surprising to me that the report shows lower costs for DER, distributed energy resource, higher penetrations of distributed energy resources. I think a key question in my mind for the report, and maybe in sticking with the low cost, no cost themes, is what role you see for market players to enter and bid into the market capacity from VPPs or other kind of distributed aggregation of distributed energy resources.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner Waszutynski. I heard you talk about your Polish family, and my dad is Polish, so I'm happy I used to be Biegońska. So to answer your question, there's, it's I've worked in before coming to Odo. I was in Europe, where the markets are much more similar to PJM or ISO New England in terms of having a really robust market and having more entry points for market actors. I think that I know that PGE, for example, is developing more opportunities for VPPs. And so, it's more and I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't know, but it's more utility by utility at the moment.
Yeah.
But we do kind of lean in on recommendations to enable more flexibility. And so it's an area that we identify as really important to develop and to build out and to mainstream. And I think with the emergence of with the upcoming, I would say, day ahead markets, I would have a question of whether I think that's another area for exploration to see if there.
Yeah, Edith, what I would say is, just from my perspective, the power of a market, and I'm not telling you anything that you don't know already, but like the power of a market is price discovery. And if there's one entity being the buyer and the seller, then there's no way, there's not a market. You need to have a marketplace where somebody could say, I need this much flexible capacity, who can give it to me. So that's all. That was my point, and wondering if there's any market reform kind of thoughts. And maybe that's not really a question for you. It's since we have representatives on the call, maybe it's more of a question of legislating. But I'll it's not really a question, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just say that we don't have a specific action on exactly what you're saying, but I'd say that directionally we're really encouraging activity in this area and are really happy to support it with analysis and however we can.
Senator Golden.
Thank you. Having a little trouble with the system. I'm not sure if you can see me or my hand or whatever, but thank you. And Emily, thank you for the presentation. The most surprising piece for me, I think it was your slide 8, projecting 20+% reduction in overall demand by the year 2050. And I'm in general media don't say that and are really concerned about meeting demand reduction, not in Oregon specifically, but generally speaking. And one thing, so I'd like your thoughts on that and what you can tell us about development of that assumption. And specifically, I think one of the issues is how much that would depend on levels of public investment. So we passed a bill a really good bill in my view, on heat pumps, providing heat pumps, and we're not going to be able to afford nearly the kind of projections we had in mind. I think similar story around weatherization and healthy buildings. We know what we want to do, we're just not able to pay for it. And by the way, I'm all ears to your bullet about near step actions that have low impact on the state budget. You got my attention with that one. But I guess if I have one question is, well, generally, what can you tell us about the assumptions for that projection of demand reduction, and specifically, how much does it hinge on levels of public investment?
Thanks, Senator Gold.
Yeah, that's the slide.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, I mean, what we hear about the most in the media is electricity demand growth, and this is consistent with that. So I'll just start with that. What we see is energy, kind of overall energy reduction, and that's largely in vehicles, for example, because when you switch from an internal combustion to an electric vehicle, you significantly reduce just the energy requirements of that vehicle while you're making that switch. So I just wanted to make that point to start off. I'll say that this is not a forecast. This is a view of the least cost path that we could follow to meet our energy policy objectives. It's not guaranteed, and it will rely on more funding. How much exactly is hard to say because a lot of these technologies are getting pretty close to market parity. I remember when we were working with Evolved research on the modeling, when we looked at a scenario, and this is before a lot of the changes that have happened at federal level had happened. If there was no support for electric vehicles, there's still a big global market that's bringing the costs down. And so, market parity is 6 years out longer than it would be otherwise, kind of the point at which that EV is the same purchase cost as an equivalent internal combustion engine vehicle. So part of this is, I think market forces will deliver, but we have an action in the energy strategy that focuses on establishing a revolving loan fund. And we actually think that we can take the first steps to that now. We don't have to wait to get going on it. Obviously, we'd have to identify seed funding for a revolving loan fund, but that's really in recognition that the amount of investment that's needed in the energy sector is just, it requires us to do things differently. It requires us to ramp up some activity. And it requires a bigger source of funding that's less subject to boom and bust cycles. And right now we went from a boom cycle to a bust cycle. And in terms of support for a lot of clean energy technologies. And so we're hoping that revolving loan fund, which is something that a lot of other states have put in place, and that Washington, for example, is working on right now, would help to finance that transition with low and no cost loans. And not only, we need to continue to rely on grants to some extent as well, but that's a mechanism that would refresh over time and hopefully could grow over time.
So quick follow-up. I do understand the notion in that graph that we're talking about an increase in electricity demand, but a decrease in total energy demand. I'm just not understanding the decrease in total energy demand, given that we are not pursuing in Oregon, and I'm going to guess elsewhere, the kind of demand reductions programs that are required. So, and just, I think I'm hearing different from the national media, but, this point ends up being really important about our strategy. And I'm confused at the moment.
Let me chime in here a little bit. The reduction in demand, as you can see from the graphic, comes from two areas. One, from energy efficiency in different appliances and our housing and our buildings. The building stock gets more efficient, and then transportation. As Edith said, shifting from an ICE vehicle to an EV uses a lot less energy on a total BTU basis. So this isn't just electricity, it's all forms of energy. So you get that energy efficiency in the transportation and the building sector that really drives the reduction in it. The investments to do all of this, most of which will happen anyway. We're going to keep the lights on. We're going to meet the demand. We're going to make our businesses and homes still operate. And so all those new resources we need and the replacements of heating systems as they go out will be replaced with heat pumps. All of those things mostly happen regardless of what we do. What we're showing here is the least cost path to do that. So the reference case that we built, but the modeling shows this is the least cost path to do that. We tested other ways to do it, but all of them, cost more. So if we veer off the least cost path, it costs us more to do that. Regarding state funding, Senator, the state funding will help, but it's not essential. The state funding can help us with the equity and the pace at which we adopt all of this. The legislature will make these decisions and have that be a trade-off with other priorities of whether or not we think that the equity and the pace and making sure that we're on this track is a priority for the legislature, and therefore providing public funding for finances for incentives. If we don't do it, it'll probably be slower, and we won't get as equitable an outcome, and we won't be there as fast as we would hope.
Thank you.
We are needing to move ahead off this topic, given that there is still some hands up and that I think there's a lot for us to take from the energy strategy. I think it would be good for us to circle back to it at a later meeting and really spend more time talking about it, because I think there's, as was said earlier, you know, it's just, there's a wealth of knowledge in this report that's, I think, should be considered. It's great that there's some new next step actions that are included. So I think it'd be great for us to circle back to it at a later date. But now I'm going to turn things over to Liz.
Hi, good morning. Can people hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Phew.
And
So many.
maybe
Yeah.
one quick thing, sorry, Liz, before you start. I just wanted to thank the commissioners that have volunteered to be on the Natural Climate Solutions Subcommittee, or a committee, I guess, of the commission. As we've discussed before, we are directed by House Bill 3409 to develop a goal recommendation for what we can do to increase net sequestration in Oregon's natural and working lands. And the deliverables that were also included in that are going to help us identify a goal. These are really important, big reports on this body of work. And I'm really happy to have other commissioners who are getting more steeped in it, so that when we go to set a goal next spring, we will be fully informed. So with that, I'll turn it over to you guys. Sorry.
No, thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioners. We're pleased to be here today with two of our 3 project teams to report on their initial findings. I'd like to jump on the Polish heritage bandwagon. My family name is Rutkowski. My grandfather changed it in the 1940s, and I've often thought of changing it back. So I just wanted to shout out to Edith and Commissioner Washtinsky. You know, just some solidarity. We have a lot to get through, as has already been mentioned, and there's a lot coming at you in these next presentations. Please keep track of your questions or plop them in the chat, and we in the project team will do our best to answer them as we go along. Discussion time is limited. Then we'd like today, if you have additional questions, we'll be happy to work with the project teams to provide responses and post them to the meeting materials. Next slide, please. Starting off with the biggest picture, and perhaps a great transition from the previous presentation, we'll put the natural climate solutions work in context of greater societal climate goals. Generally, climate action fits under 2 major categories necessary to meet our global goals. We need to take action to rapidly reduce emissions and also rapidly increase actions that remove carbon that is already in the atmosphere. We need to do both of these things to stop global temperatures from rising. The Commission for a long time now has talked about the first category, and indeed the energy strategy continues that discussion in order to meet the goals the state has set. Through the natural climate solutions legislation that passed in 2023, the Commission is now talking about and working with the state and stakeholders to understand and account for land management actions that are in this second category. Strategies that remove carbon from the sky are generally called carbon removal strategies. Strategies that are more geochemical or technological in nature are also given this label. However, land management strategies or natural climate solutions can be and are being deployed right now. And as we know, many provide many benefits, not only carbon removal. They are a win-win-win and can help meet nature-based mitigation, adaptation, and resilience goals. And as such, they are a no regrets investment the legislature has prioritized via the related Natural and Working Lands Fund. Next slide. Could you go back one? Okay, maybe go forward one. I'm so sorry. Thank you. And then we'll have to go back, Jen. Okay, so to understand if we are increasing removal of carbon from the atmosphere, it is important to understand what is happening on the landscape in terms of greenhouse gases, and also to track specific land management actions over time to track progress. HB 3409 asked Odo and the Commission and 7 land managing agencies to do just that. 2 of the 3 work streams we were directed to do establish these 2 types of accounting systems, fundamental for tracking greenhouse gases across the landscape and to track outcome-based progress for nature-based climate actions. We will be sharing some preliminary results from the inventory work today, while we will be talking with you about land-based strategies and associated metrics beginning in January that will enable the state to track action-based progress. Go back one, Jen. Thank you. This work, which is depicted by the green and the blue arrows, along with the Natural Climate Solutions Workforce Study sandwiched in the middle, not only will help the state take organized nature-based climate action, but the information will also help the Commission establish carbon sequestration and storage goals in the spring. Odo will be working with the agencies, the consultants, the Natural and Working Lands Advisory Committee, and the committee of the Commission that the chair just mentioned to provide feedback and perspective for a final staff report with recommendations for the Commission to consider in late spring to set the goals. However, today we are excited to share initial findings from the inventory and workforce project teams who have been working at a rapid pace since July and are now deep in the work of interpreting results and writing up final reports. Both of these teams will present to you again in December to share final thoughts and a roadmap for future work in these respective areas for the Commission to consider. Next slide. And next slide. As I just mentioned, there are 2 formal engagement groups advising this work. The chair has convened the Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and the specific slide shown describes the specific positions and are in the left-hand column. We'll take a moment to say that this group has been incredibly engaged, prepared, and helpful. They have shared their perspectives, their contacts, their technical expertise and experiences, which has been incredibly important for both of the projects we're going to share draft results with today. Next slide. The other group that comes together is the Interagency Working Group, made of the 7 land managing agencies named in the statute. DEQ is also included on this slide, and they deserve a special thanks because they have been a great partner and advisor while we have worked to establish methodologies for land-based net carbon inventory to ensure we are not duplicating efforts or interfering with what the state has already established. Next slide. This slide quickly summarizes the engagements to date for both projects. You see the Odo facilitated groups at the top. Stemming from those meetings, there have been numerous individual discussions with agency staff or technical experts. And with that, Jason will take a moment to ground you in some terms and inventory fundamentals before you hear from the project team. Jason?
Thank you, Liz. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Next slide, please. So before we get into the details of the inventory, we wanted to remind you all of some of those key concepts and vocabulary that you'll be hearing a lot about from our project team. And just as a reminder, we also provided you with a glossary before the meeting. It was pretty dense. And you can reference that in this meeting as well if you're having a tough time keeping track of everything here. And it may contain some other information that we just don't have the time or capacity to provide a fuller explanation for. But on this slide, you can first see the 4 main pools of carbon that we are generally talking about in Oregon's land. The first is in the top left here, which is above ground biomass, and that generally consists of all of the living vegetative matter on the land, like trees, shrubs, and grasses. On the bottom left there is below ground biomass, and that primarily refers to the root systems of the plants on the land. On above, and just a quick note, you will probably hear a contractor talk about biomass in general, which is sort of a term that groups this above ground and below ground component together. Dead organic matter on the top right there refers to the parts of the land like dead trees, fallen branches, and leaves. And dead organic matter is sometimes also referred to as above ground dead biomass. I think the contract team will mostly stick with dead organic matter when they talk today. And the final pool on the bottom right there is soil carbon, which is sort of made up of dead and disintegrated plant matter that has been incorporated into soils. Some soils are richer in carbon than others, and in this inventory, you're going to hear us talk about two primary types of soils. One is organic and the other one is mineral. And there are many differences between them, but just know for the sake of the inventory that organic soils are generally rich in carbon and are often a source of greenhouse gases. And mineral soils are more poor in carbon and are usually not counted as a source in the inventory. Next slide, please. So here's where we kind of get into some of the other critical terms. I apologize for the busy slide, but I'll try to walk you through here. Critical carbon accounting lingo includes a carbon pool or store, which I already talked about in the previous slide. And that's broadly speaking a system that has the capacity to remove or emit carbon. A carbon stock is usually referring to the amount of carbon in a particular carbon pool or store. Carbon fluxes and stock change describes the movement and exchange of carbon between pools over time. Emissions are greenhouse gases that are released to the atmosphere, and on the figure to the right, you can see emissions in that sort of orange arrow, and the emissions that we're going to be talking about in this inventory specifically are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Removals are greenhouse gases that are taken out of the atmosphere, and for the sake of this inventory, that usually refers to carbon dioxide. Net flux refers to the balance between emissions and removals, or it's kind of calculated as emissions minus removals. So it kind of tells you net how much carbon dioxide equivalent is moving in and out of the system, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. Sequestration and storage are the processes of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and storing them. And again, the greenhouse gases we're referring to here are carbon dioxide, which is referred to in the shorthand as CO2, methane, which the shorthand is CH4, and nitrous oxide, which the shorthand is N2O. Collectively, you may also hear the term non-CO2 emissions, which refers to methane and or nitrous oxide. Next slide. Okay, so the basic sort of high-level description of what the land-based net carbon inventory does is the work of it provides estimates of carbon stocks, stock change, and resulting greenhouse gas flux, again from those greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, over time from Oregon's lands. But the report that we will be producing specifically reports on estimates of greenhouse gas flux over time resulting from these two main activities, which is one, land remaining of the same type. So in this map on the right here, you can see these 6 different land categories: forest land, grassland, cropland. So land remaining in the same type might be forest land that remains forest land over time. The other category is land converted to another type. So for example, forest land converting to grassland, say due to like wildfire or some other burn. And generally everything is reported in a common unit of million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And just as a reminder, carbon dioxide equivalent is a term that sort of describes the relative warming potential of the different greenhouse gases in comparison to the warming potential of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide has a CO2 equivalency of 1 because it is carbon dioxide, and the other emissions have a much greater carbon dioxide equivalence. But they're all reported in this common unit so that we don't have to break out discussions by the individual gases. The work also, or the inventory will also include biomass change on the lands, land management practices, wildfires, and other activities that the group will talk about today. So next slide, please. So what is an inventory used for? As we conceive of it, and as they're generally conceived, inventories can help us establish long-term trends in emissions and removals from the land starting in 1990 in our inventory. They can be the basis for future projections, so understanding where we might go under business as usual policies or just given general trends in the climate and land use. They can help us track progress of how the land is changing when updated routinely, and as we are currently mandated to update every 2 years, or every even-numbered year to be clear. And they can help us inform policymaking by telling us how different land management policies may be reflecting emissions or may be reflected in emissions from the lands, and to a limited degree can help us track the performance of specific programs and policies, but not all of them, as Liz has talked about previously. Finally, the inventory can also demonstrate the importance of natural and working lands to long-term strategies to reduce emissions. As you'll see, the land in Oregon actually can sequester quite a substantial amount of carbon, and that's with unintentional management for carbon or for climate mitigation. So next slide, please. This is where it gets maybe a little more complicated, but just hold tight. I'm going to try to walk you through how an inventory or how data get used in an inventory and how an inventory is effectively constructed. And so an inventory will use a lot of different kinds of data, and the amount of data that are used may depend on the part of the state you're looking at, data availability, and the data quality, among other factors. In general, you kind of start by establishing a few common data sets to give you a base level of understanding of the land. In this map, we're showing you the land cover of the state in those different colors, and you saw the categories earlier. For example, this layer is established by the National Land Cover Database layer on land cover. And this is an example of one of those common data sets, and it helps you understand what kind of biomass you have generally across the land. And from there, you start layering on additional data sets like ecoregion, which can tell you about the climate and how biomass might accumulate in that climate and then soil type, which can tell you a bit more information about soil carbon, like I said, distinguishing between, for example, organic and mineral soils. And from there, as you search around for data for the different land cover categories in different parts of the state, you'll find specialized data sets and add them on top of the existing layers that you already have. So for example, if we start on the right and then go counterclockwise, you may only have these three basic layers. Oh, and to be clear, this is just an example. This is not exactly how the inventory is constructed, but is based on it. So for example, on the right in the grassland area, you may have these three layers of land cover, ecoregion, and soil type, and that might be all the data you have. But in developed land at the top, you may have additional data such as on tree canopy cover that can help improve your estimates of biomass in urban trees. On the bottom left, in the coastal wetlands, where in Oregon you have a dedicated team of researchers that is producing data and models to estimate carbon. You may have a high resolution data set on wetland perimeters and also tidal extent that can help you produce some very sophisticated estimates of carbon. And it's worth repeating again that what you're seeing here is just an example of the kinds of data that are used in an inventory. The data here are all spatial, but many data sets we used in the inventory are not spatial. For example, in cropland, we have tabular data, which is data that sort of arrives to us in the form of tables and reports that may summarize, for example, the acreage of crops planted within a county. Or we may have anecdotal data from extension offices, like from Oregon State University, on typical crop rotations used in different parts of the state. These are all kinds of data that can be used in the inventory, and so it's quite complex. So in total, we looked at around a little over 40 data sets from local, municipal, county, and federal sources, and had to make a lot of decisions about which ones were appropriate and best for use in this inventory. The project team later on is going to talk more about the specific data sets used in the different land categories and regions of the state, but this gives you a basic idea of what's going on. Next slide, please. So data or natural working land inventories are complex and require the estimation of net flux from different land categories, pools within those categories, and species of greenhouse gases. And so estimating these fluxes may require different data sets and methods, and some of those data sets and methods are more sophisticated or regionally accurate than others. As the project team developed its methodologies to produce estimates of greenhouse gas flux, we've used a system of tiers which are established by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to note the level of sophistication and to help us identify which methodologies may be in need of improvement over time as we maintain and update the inventory. In general, tiers increase in complexity and accuracy from tier 1 to tier 3. And so, for example, on the left side here, tier 1, this tier may use data that's not specific to a country, but is just collected from global studies. It may employ default emission factors, and it may not capture many land management practices. Tier 2 is a little more complex and potentially more accurate, and it uses data specific to a given country. It may employ emission factors again, and it may capture some land management practices that were not captured in Tier 1. And Tier 3, which is the more complex and hopefully more accurate tier, this uses data that may be more specific to state or region. It employs models as opposed to emission factors, and it may capture more land management practices. And as you can see in that little icon, it may be divided into subregions like county or ecoregion and things like that. Next slide, please. Once you have your data and your methods kind of identified, you can start kind of going through this process of selecting the appropriate tier of analysis for different parts of the state. So again, this starts with an assessment of the available data sets and methods for given land cover categories and other factors about the land. Then you might identify the soil type, and if it's organic, where there's just not a whole lot of data or studies, you have to use a Tier 1 soil and biomass methodology. If it's a mineral soil and you know and you're looking at a specific crop type that is very well studied, you may be able to bring that up to Tier 3 methodology to estimate carbon and soil and biomass. But if you have a crop type that's not well studied, but is still mineral soil, you might go down to Tier 2 estimates of soil and Tier 1 estimates of biomass. So this is happening for all the different land cover categories across the state. This is just sort of an example to show you how these decisions are made about methodologies to use. Next slide, please. And just throwing this up here for emphasis, we are very interested in the regional climate differences. Whoop, it's running away. In the regional climate differences across the state and the different ecoregions. We separated a lot of the analysis in this inventory by the different ecoregions of the state as established in the state's conservation strategy, and so these are the main regions. They may be reported at the sort of land cover level, so just talking about forest land within forest land or forest land remaining forest land, but there's differences as you are looking at forest across the state and across the different ecoregions. Next slide, please. And so today the project team is going to be describing the initial findings of the draft methodologies they've selected. And they're just going to walk you through the different land cover or the inventory draft findings in this way, looking first at the inventory structure, going through land classification, statewide totals, and then going through each of the individual land categories that were described above, with a special call out for biomass burning, which includes both wildfires and prescribed burns. And so with that, if Olga is on the line, I will pass it to her.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Jason, Liz, for setting the stage. Sound check, thumbs up. If you can hear me, great. All right, so I will start with a summary of kind of takeaways so far from the analysis that the team has done and give you a little bit of an overview of the inventory, in addition to the basics that Jason just presented. And talk about some of the cross-cutting information that will help you understand the results that we're presenting. In general, once we go into each category separately, you will see sort of three elements for each. One will be an overview of the data and methods that are used. The second will be the results themselves, and the third component will be the takeaways that we're able to generate so far based on the analysis. Next slide, please. So the team is still working through the estimates and finalizing all of that, but so far we can already draw some conclusions and lessons from that, and I want to highlight them right off the start. The first is that we're using the National Land Cover Dataset, as Jason had mentioned and showed the map of, which is currently the best available data source for us to be able to classify all the lands in Oregon. But it does have limitations because it's a remote sensing data set and kind of really bases the interpretation and assignment of land classes on what it sees, so the land cover, not necessarily land use and function. So that is something to keep in mind. And, you know, as a result, looking at kind of expanding regional data on carbon fluxes and, you know, supplementing these national data sets with land surveys that are based and done in Oregon specifically would really enhance the robustness and the accuracy of the inventory. Another thing that I wanted to highlight and emphasize is that lands have emissions as well as removals. In particular, when we talk about the drained organic soils or wetland methane, which are ending up to be important sources of emissions in Oregon. And so far, based on the incomplete preliminary analysis that we have done, because it does not include land conversions yet, we see that the removals, net land removals in Oregon were at about 68 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 1990 when the inventory begins, and have decreased to about 29 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent at the current level. So it's the preliminary results show net land removals in Oregon, but they have decreased over time. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit more context and define the scope of the inventory. This inventory accounts for all the land in the state. It's aligned with the IPCC guidelines and the national GHG inventory sector methodology to the extent possible. The national GHG inventory follows the IPCC guidelines, but of course it sort of applies them in a way that's specific to the US context. And what we have done is refine it even further. That is, you know, makes it most relevant to the state level context. This is really key in order to ensure that we are accounting for all emissions and sources and sinks as without double counting or undercounting things. And as Jason had mentioned, we're using a tiered approach. So sometimes you are able to use a more advanced estimation method and sometimes not. And it really varies by category. Overall, we have estimated emissions and removals for 44 categories. You won't see every single one presented today. We aggregate them at the land category level. And of those, 9 of them were estimated using a tier 3 approach, 7 were done with a tier 2 approach, and 28 were done with a tier 1 approach. Again, we're accounting for emissions and removals due to carbon stock changes and non-CO2 emissions, so methane and nitrous oxide, that are specific to each land category. The time series covers 1990 to 2024. 1990 is the reference year. I believe it's also the year that the state uses for climate reduction goals, so it made sense to have that be the start of the inventory time series. And again, I just like to emphasize that these are results that so far only include the land remaining in the same land category emissions, and there will be additional numbers included in the inventory that will likely change the totals that you see presented today. Next slide, please. So the first step in preparation of this inventory is to define the land in Oregon. And currently there's not a statewide accepted definition for these categories. These kind of broad 6 categories are based on the IPCC guidelines. And then we the state can decide kind of what actually constitutes forest land, cropland, grassland, wetland, developed land, other land, etc. And so because there's not a set definition at the moment, we used the land classifications that are used by the National Land Cover Data Set that has been mentioned. And so in the end, these definitions are quite similar to what the National GHG Inventory uses, but there are some differences in terms of thresholds for what constitutes like forest, whether it's 20% vegetation cover or less, or or some other number. And so the definitions used in the Oregon inventory are based on the NLCD definitions. And grouped, some subclasses are grouped together to make these 6 broad categories. So once we have the land kind of classified and defined, we then need to look at the land trends and how land transitions from one category to another. Next slide, please. And here we give you a snapshot of kind of the overall change between 1990 and 2021. Grasslands make up almost half of Oregon's land mass, and you see that the acreage actually increased slightly between 1990 and 2021. Forest lands are next in size in terms of coverage, and those decreased by 1.5%. Then we have croplands that also decreased as wetlands saw a decrease. And then developed lands, all that land had to go somewhere, and most likely it became developed land. The other land category isn't shown on the graph, but is included in the table just for complete accounting. Other land includes rock, sand, ice, cover. So it's not really, we don't estimate emissions and removals for that because there's not a lot of carbon fluxes that are happening on those lands, but we do include it in overall accounting of land area to make sure that everything is consistent. And another thing that I wanted to quickly highlight is that this graph, the dark blue or the teal bars that show the land in 2021, those include both land that has been sort of stayed the same over this entire period, as well as land that became that type over this period. So there may be it may look like a smaller decrease in forest land by acres, but there's less of the kind of the original forest remaining, and maybe a chunk of that forest land is sort of new growth forest that has been added. Next slide, please. So once we are able to kind of classify the land and segment it into land remaining in the same land use category and land converted to a different land use category, that gives us our main kind of buckets of where we are accounting for carbon fluxes and how we're accounting for these carbon fluxes in the land. And then in addition to that, we are looking at emissions and removals that are based on land management activities and disturbances and other biogeochemical processes that are occurring that may result in non-CO2 emissions as well. And that is sort of really the basis for all the results that you will see presented today. Next slide, please. So the state statute mandates that the inventory is updated biannually, but some key land data sets that we're using are only collected every 5 years. And so because of that, we are estimating emissions for those years that we have the data sets for, and then we're interpolating between them to to derive annualized estimates that produce a time series of emissions and removals. You see an example graph, very similar to what you will be seeing during the rest of this presentation. The values above the x-axis, the positive bars that are stacked, orange, red, green, yellow, those are emission sources, and they're usually reported as positive numbers. These are emissions that are going into the atmosphere. Removals are what you see as blue bars. Those are negative emissions, essentially, right? Things that are being pulled out of the atmosphere. And so then for each category, we estimate net emissions and removals when we sum these together. And then each category is added as well to produce a net statewide estimate of emissions and removals. Next slide, please. Here's the tabular summary of the preliminary results. You see results here, not for the entire time series, because that would simply not fit on the slide, but you see 1990, 2006, and then we show the most recent 8 years to kind of help demonstrate the most recent trend. The numbers in parentheses are the removals, so negative numbers. And as you could see, forest, remaining forest land, which also includes the harvested wood product pools, is the main net sink in the state, while all the other main categories result in emissions. And over time, the net sink at the state level kind of decreases gradually from 68 million metric tons to 29 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So with this overview, I'm going to turn it over now to the rest of the team to go through each of the land categories that you see listed here. And we'll kind of give you a little bit of a deeper dive into how each of these rows was derived. With that, I'll turn it over to Anoop.
Good morning. Today I'm presenting preliminary results from forest emission. Okay. The slide needs switches, please. Today I'm presenting preliminary results from forest remaining forest. Our inventory tracks the emissions and removals from forests using a National Land Cover dataset, forest group type maps, and forest inventory analysis plots. We follow the same harvested wood product model that Oregon Department of Forest uses, ensuring consistency with state reporting. Next slide, please. Now, the graph on the right tells an important story about Oregon's forest as a climate asset. The green bars, so forest biomass, trees removing CO2 from the atmosphere. The values are negative, means the carbon is being pulled down from the atmosphere and stored. Now the orange bars on the top show a hidden problem, the emissions from drain organic soils. Even though the forests are growing on top, the peat underneath is decomposing and releasing CO2 continuously. The values are positive because the CO2 is being released to the atmosphere. The trend that we see that concerns us is CO2 removal dropped from 63 million metric tons in 1990 to 39 million metric tons in 2024. Emissions from drain organic soils also decreased by a million metric tons, reflecting loss of forest cover on these areas. Now I'll pass to Olga for harvested wood products result.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, so just wanted to highlight this particular subcategory under a forest, remaining forest. So when when the timber is harvested, it sort of moves into the separate carbon pool that's called harvested wood products, which is captured in two additional subcategories. The wood that is in products that are in use, things like furniture, building materials, paper, etc., anything that's made out of timber ultimately, as well as materials that then once at their end of their life cycle get disposed of at the solid waste disposal sites. And so there are models that have been parameterized for Oregon that capture the amount of carbon that comes from timber harvested in Oregon only, and then kind of tracks through its life cycle to estimate the amount of carbon each year that gets added or removed to it. And so the results you see are from that, derived from that model. And in 1990, the amount of carbon that was removed by harvested wood products was almost 25 million metric tons of CO2. By 2024, this amount decreased to about 8.3 million metric tons, but harvested wood products do constitute a net sink for Oregon. The main reason for the decrease in the size is actually reduction in harvesting. So that is kind of reflected in the results that you see. And then back to Anoop for the summary.
Yes. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways from this initial and this preliminary results is that Oregon's forests are a massive climate asset. They remove approximately 39 million metric tons of CO2 annually. It's a substantial sink. Protecting this capacity is critical to meeting climate goals. Drained organic soil, even though they cover only a small land area, they emit 3.5 to 4.5 million metric tons of CO2 yearly and continuously. So sometimes they emit for decades and even centuries, making them disproportionately important emission sources that must be tracked and potentially restored. Forests are critical to Oregon's climate mitigation strategy. The forest sector annual carbon removal plays a major role in offsetting greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, energy, agriculture, and other sectors across the state. So with that, I'll pass on to Grassland team. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? So
Yes.
the grassland inventory we had three different approaches to do the quantification. One of them was for biomass carbon. The second was for organic soils, and the third were for mineral soils carbon. This portion of the inventory considers both grasslands and rangelands, and we look at them by soil type, EPA ecoregions, as well as counties. The actual fluxes, the greenhouse gas fluxes that we had included our biomass, soil carbon, nitrous oxide, and methane. To determine the grassland areas, we use the NLCD land cover maps, as we've talked about before, and EPA level 3 ecoregion data. This helped us determine the grassland type, such as shrubs, perennials, and grazing lands across the state's various ecoregions. We also used USDA's Soil Survey Geographic Database, or SURGO, to identify organic soils which require a special calculation method. For the above ground biomass, we use the rangeland analysis platform, and this allowed us to calculate the shrub and perennial herbaceous biomass. For below ground carbon, we use USDA's Comet Farm model to calculate the soil carbon, and we'll talk a little bit more about the soil carbon, the Comet Farm model, when we talk about cropland inventory. For emissions from organic soils, we used a Tier 1 method from the IPCC. So in this part of the inventory, we had both Tier 1 and Tier 3 calculation methodologies. Moving on to the next slide, what you can see here is between 1990 and 2024, the overall removals from mineral soils, the overall removals, the overall removals from biomass, the sequestration by biomass increased from 0.47 million metric tons of CO2e in 1990 to 2.59 in 2024. So over time, you see a gradual increase in the biomass. At the same time, we're seeing an increase in the emissions of mineral soils from 0.23 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent to 0.88. And then for drained organic soils, you're seeing a gradual decrease in emissions from 7.85 to 5.52. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide on the key takeaways. So the biggest takeaway on this is that the grasslands are net emitters of greenhouse gases. So while they uptake biomass, and it varies by region and by year, as you saw on the bottom graph, grassland organic soils release a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Second key takeaway is that grassland carbon is primarily stored in below ground biomass. So this is things like roots and soil organic matter, and they store twice as much carbon as above ground vegetation. This really means that preserving grassland management is a key strategy to protecting soil carbon and preserving climate benefits. We'll move from grassland on to croplands. So for croplands, we also had three different approaches to quantify the carbon flux. The first was for crops where significant research has been conducted. These include things like wheat, alfalfa, and potatoes. The second approach was for crops without extensive carbon flux research. This includes a lot of the tree crops within the state, as well as the specialty crops. And then the final method was for organic soils. We calculated the organic fluxes. Stay back on the slide. Yes, thank you. So we calculated above ground biomass for things such as orchards and vineyards, soil carbon for all crops on mineral soils, and soil carbon, nitrous oxide, and methane for crops grown on organic soils. Because nitrous oxide from the use of fertilizer is a part of the state's sector-based inventory, it was not included in this portion of the inventory to avoid double counting. Like with other land areas, we used the NOCD land cover maps and EPA Level 3 ecoregion to identify the land use types. We also used USDA's census data to determine the acres by cropland and by county. And then USDA Surgo data was used to identify organic soils. In this one, you can see that we had three different tiers used. Tier 1 for organic soils, Tier 2 for those non-modeled crops on mineral soils, and Tier 3 for modeled crops on mineral soils. Now we'll go on to the next slide, and what you can see is that of the 220 crops that are grown in Oregon, we had about 35 that we covered here. A large portion of them, about 22 on the left-hand side, were done by a Tier 2 method. So that it is specific within region and climate and soil type, but didn't include things like planting date, harvest date, tillage, things of that nature. Those were with the Tier 3 crops, and you can see the crops over there that were done with the Tier 3. And in addition to doing those Tier 3 crops, because we could use a process-based model, we were able to look at the different rotations that happen. So for example, an alfalfa oat rotation or a winter wheat and peas. When we look at all of the acres that the majority of the acres in the state are part of those tier 3 crops. And so we were able to cover the majority of the emissions for crops in the state. On to the next slide, we'll see the results. So on soil carbon, we see two different stories. We see carbon removals from mineral soils. They've gradually decreased from 2.47 MMT CO2e in 1990 to 0.48 in 2024. Organic soils, on the other hand, are a significant and relatively constant source of emissions, decreasing just slightly from 6 million metric tons CO2e in 1990 to 5.6 in 2024. Finally, I'll point out here that cropland biomass, such as Christmas trees, pear orchards, and vineyards, are neither a significant source or removal over the inventory period. Move on to the key takeaways. As I mentioned just previously, organic soils are a significant emission source. They have a consistent emissions and they are the largest source of emissions, but only account for 9% of all cropland acres. So these lands offer an opportunity for intervention, such as restoration to wetlands, shifting from cropland to grassland, or changing the cropping systems. While the total area on mineral soils has decreased about 20%, total acres, the carbon removals have increased 80%. We don't know the exact reasons right now, and we're doing some more analysis on it, but the largest drivers appear to be in counties in the warm temperate zones of Oregon. As mentioned before, carbon in biomass, such as orchards and vineyards, is negligible and stayed relatively constant. And then another note on the organic soils. These organic soils are typically located in areas between the Cascades and the coastal range in Lynn, Washington, and Yamahill counties. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues to talk through wetlands.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, you sound good.
Great. Okay. So the area of wetland was determined by the land cover data sets. So that's going to be the National Land Cover Data Set and CCAP, which is the Coastal Change and Analysis Program's coastal specific data set. And this tells us what the area and what the type of wetland is. So whether or not wetland is forested or not forested, for example. We also needed to know whether wetland was coastal or inland, and whether there has been any agricultural use on top of wetlands. Like other groups, we also subdivide the wetland area by soil type and ecoregion, and that's primarily because there are some greenhouse fluxes that are specific to different soil types and ecoregions. So once we had our wetland area, we subdivided across these categories of interest. We calculated greenhouse gas emissions and removals across biomass, dead organic matter, and soil. And we also estimate methane and nitrous oxide emissions from wetlands. So the data that we use to get our estimates of greenhouse gas emissions and removals are derived from multiple data sources, including the IPCC. I've already mentioned the Coastal Change Analysis Program dataset. Oregon has a ton of regional data on coastal wetland ecosystems, primarily through the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, as well as the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership and the Nature Conservancy. And so we also were able to use that regional specific data for the coastal inventory. For inland wetlands, we really had to go to the literature and the IPCC for our data. So our methodology is primarily tier 2. It uses or applies tabular emissions and removals data across these spatial land cover data sets. And I probably should have mentioned before, but while there has been a previous blue carbon or coastal wetland inventory in Oregon, this is the first time we're actually incorporating inland wetlands. And they've only been incorporated in other state, national, and working land inventories within the last year. So this is all like very new and preliminary. Next slide, please. Okay, so we find that coastal wetlands have consistently been a source of greenhouse gas emissions since the 1990s, emitting around 0.18 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents in 1990, and then 0.17 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents in 2024. Our preliminary results suggest that inland wetlands are also a consistent source of greenhouse gases, emitting around 2.34 million metric tons of CO2 in 1990 and 2.36 million metric tons of CO2 in 2024. Across all wetlands, we calculated the nitrous oxide emissions from fish hatcheries, finding that hatcheries fish production leads to consistent emissions of nitrous oxide around 0.002 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So when looking at the plot on the right, we can see that the main removals of carbon dioxide from wetlands are soils and biomass, while methane emissions in coastal and in inland wetlands lead to emissions of carbon dioxide. And this is in carbon dioxide units of equivalence. Next slide, please. Compared to Oregon's initial coastal wetland blue carbon inventory, which only included tidally connected wetlands, this inventory now includes tidal and non-tidal wetlands within the coastal zone. So this leads to a 2 times increase in the total mapped area of coastal wetland, and it aligns more so with the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. We also find that coastal wetlands act as a net emission source of carbon dioxide. And this is primarily driven from methane emissions from palustrine emergent wetlands. So that's freshwater wetlands within the coastal zone. And that has to do with how one of our land cover data sets classifies wetland. But this is in units of carbon dioxide equivalents. Our preliminary results for inland wetlands also reveal that wetlands act as a net emission source of carbon dioxide, again, driven by methane emissions. And although I want to mention that although like for both coastal and inland wetlands, our results show that these ecosystems are net sources of carbon dioxide, as more data become available for Oregon's wetlands, future inventories like this result might shift in future inventories. Finally, our last takeaway is that across all wetlands, nitrous oxide emissions from hatcheries is extremely low compared to the other greenhouse gas emissions and removals, accounting for less than 0.1%. And now I will pass it to Olga.
Thanks, Lena. I am back to tell you about the final 2 categories, which are developed lands and emissions from biomass burning. So starting with developed land, here we're including carbon fluxes from urban trees, and we're counting them based on the development intensity that we're able to get from the NLCD data set that is used as for all land classification, as I had mentioned. And we're also including emissions from drained organic soils on developed land as well. The data sources for these estimates include the land use map from NLCD, as well as the tree cover data product that NLCD provides to be able to estimate how the tree density and biomass density from that. The Surgo soil maps to tell us whether the soils are organic or mineral, and then literature and values and IPCC emission factors to complete the estimates. which are tier 1 for soils and tier 2 for urban trees. Next slide, please. So here you see these two categories showed numerically as well as graphically on the right. The top graph shows the drained organic soil emissions. Those remain relatively constant at about 2.3 to 2.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent over the time series. The general increase is likely due to a slight increase in the area. And then urban trees are removing CO2 from the atmosphere as they grow. And that removal increases from about 1.3 million metric tons in 1990 to about 1.7 million metric tons in 2024. On the graph, you see that the open space and the low intensity development areas are kind of the main contributors to those removals, which is where the tree cover is the highest in different parts of Oregon. But you do see a little kind of dip and then a decrease in those numbers. And that is related to the tree cover density decreasing slightly over the last 10 years, at least according to the data set. Next slide, please. So the results tell us that the urban trees are removing CO2 from the atmosphere, and they're kind of balancing, to some extent, the emissions from the drained organic soils, but they're not large enough to create a net sink for developed lands. And these findings emphasize the value of maintaining and expanding urban tree cover and the challenge of persistent soil emissions in developed environments from the drained organic soils. I think another key takeaway here is that conducting field studies to refine emission parameters would really improve the estimate accuracy for both categories. Next slide, please. So I saw some questions in the chat flying around regarding where biomass burning emissions from wildfires are included. We are pulling them out as a separate category just to really make that clear and the contribution from that clear. We're looking at both wildfire emissions on grasslands and forest lands, as well as emissions from prescribed burns. Although we're going to highlight just the wildfire emissions during today's presentation. And we are only accounting for methane and nitrous oxide emissions in these estimates. The lost carbon from the burning is accounted in the estimates of biomass in the land categories that we already presented. The data sources that are used here come from the state. So Oregon Department of Forestry maintains a database of historic burn perimeters, but we're also including several other data sources on burn perimeters because they all capture slightly different sets of burns depending on the methodology that they use. And so what we're doing is averaging the results of all these burn perimeter data sets to get kind of a statistical average to provide the overall emission estimates for the inventory. Also using the ODF's smoke management program data set on prescribed burn activities. And the results are, given that we have these data sets and models that we can use to produce these estimates, we end up using tier 2 approaches and tier 3 approaches, especially for the wildfire emissions. Next slide, please. So here are the results for the wildfire emissions in Oregon. You see two plots here. The above one shows the area burned, and below one you see the corresponding emissions. And I wanted to highlight the difference between emissions that occur on grasslands and forest lands. So grasslands are orange bars and forests are blue bars. Some wildfires cover really large areas and impact more forests. Some impact more grassland areas. And so for those fires where grasslands are impacted more, we see that they have a significantly lower amount of emissions than those fires that occur on forest lands. And that makes sense because the amount of fuel that's available to burn is much higher on forest lands. Nonetheless, this is kind of we do see a general increase in these the amount of the area burned as well as emissions over time. And it probably isn't surprising to anybody. And we do see some years with really large spikes because of just the nature of these events, and some years are particularly affected. So overall, in 1990, we had about 0.17 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, whereas by 2024, that number has increased to 2.4 almost million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Next slide, please. So, of course, this increase in wildfire emissions underscores the need to integrate fire management and risk reduction into climate and land use management strategies. And while these are natural disturbances, their increasing magnitude highlights how climate changes and land management interacts to shape the state's carbon balance. Prescribed burn emissions have remained at a steady state level and contribute approximately 5% of all biomass burning emissions. And with landing and pile burns contributing the most out of the prescribed burn activities. I see a question
Yeah,
in the
Olga, what
chat
does
here.
landing mean?
Landing. So landing are the areas that where kind of a lot of the material, I guess, ends up post-harvest, like the area where the harvesting, the timber gets kind of collected and before it's removed from the forest. So that's like that area where the harvest landing, the harvest lands, essentially. And then there's a lot of kind of slash and debris and residue that remains in that area. Next slide, please. We are just bringing up the total summary again for you to see now that we've shown you kind of line by line what those results are composed of. And then next slide maybe is a better visual. These are the same numbers but shown as a chart with the net flux shown with the blue line. The one thing I do want to emphasize again is these are incomplete estimates so far. These only include land remaining in the same category, emissions and removals, and we are still analyzing the carbon fluxes due to land conversions. And so likely those will result in net emissions as well, because conversions tend to result in losses of biomass. We don't know how much yet, but likely the overall net sink that you see here on the graph will be different. And then next slide and final slide. Closing with just reminding you about some of the main messages from the work that the team has done so far is that we are using the best available data for classifying land in Oregon, but it does have limitations, and that impacts the estimates and the interpretation of the estimates that we can make. Of course, having more regional data on carbon fluxes across all the land uses so that we can go to higher tier and improve the robustness and accuracy of the inventory is going to be something that will continue to drive improvements in the inventory estimates. There are emissions as well as removals that need to be considered, and in particular, drained organic soils and wetland methane are important sources of emissions on land. And finally, from the preliminary results so far, we see that the net land removals decreased between 1990 and 2024, going from about 68 million metric tons of CO2e to 29 million metric tons. And with that, I will pass it back to Liz, Jason, to facilitate any Q&A that if we have time for that.
All right, next slide. Jen, thank you, team. Chair, I have been following the chat questions. Would you like me to facilitate the questions that Commissioner Von Hagen, Representative Gamba, Commissioner Washutinsky, and Senator Golden have in the chat?
Sure. Yes.
Okay,
please.
we'll just go down the list. Commissioner Von Hagen, you wanted to dive a little bit more into the forest sector. You had a couple of questions. Would you like to restate those?
Sure. It seems like the big kahuna in that list, and so I'm curious about whether. So it sounds like from what I gathered from the comments that any CO2 emissions from fire are a reduction to the removals, and so that's counted as that's accounted for in the removals. Is that correct?
Yes.
So my questions are, how much of the pretty significant reduction in the contribution from forest sequestration are caused by fires? It doesn't seem like that's the full cause from what we saw. How much of it is caused by decline in productivity post-fire, sort of cumulatively? How much of it is caused by changes in harvesting practices? If rotation ages are shorter, for example, how has that contributed to it? Which we probably would see more if we could see it by landowner type. Then I think that would become more evident. And I'm just very curious about whether you have any anecdotal information so far on landowner contribution. I would have suspected that federal forests would have been contributing a lot more for removals, just given the change in forest practices in that exact time period, 1990 to 2024. So yes, the sum has left me starving for more information to understand actually what this means, because I have no idea what this actually means. If you could give me some context, that'd be great.
Those are great questions, and I would just add, team, we've talked about reductions in land cover in total, so maybe you could speak to that as well in the forest land category.
Yeah, that seemed fairly minimal. Yeah, but of course, that's definitely a factor. It was a small factor, I think.
Anoop, I can maybe address a little bit the ownership question, and then you could talk about the carbon density values. So we don't look at the ownership. We don't stratify by land ownership in the inventory. So we wouldn't be able to answer that question directly, but I think we could. That is an additional analysis that could be done to get at that. And I believe that the Oregon Department of Forestry in their kind of forestry carbon inventory certainly breaks the results down by ownership classes.
In general, even if you're not looking at landowner type, are you seeing lower carbon per acre across? Are you stratifying into those regional maps that you showed earlier? I mean, which would allow us to see, for example, forest health, contributions, decline attributed to forest health, which would be more prominent in eastern and central Oregon forests. So even stratification, I think, by geography would be super helpful in terms of understanding what the drivers are. I mean, because that's an alarming decline in removals, decline in contribution from forests. And so, it leaves one begging for more understanding of the causes.
Yeah, just to add on top of that, what you're saying is we're looking only in the results we are presenting is only from the forest land, remaining forest land. And the carbon densities we're getting the densities based on FIA plots.
Right.
And so we are using those densities and then exploiting those densities. So we don't know exactly the carbon densities in the areas that's affected by forest burn right at the time.
So sorry, say it again. You don't know the forest densities associated with forest? I didn't quite get what you said.
Okay, so the forest densities, the carbon densities we are getting is from the FIA plots. Mm-hmm. And then if those, plots and so if the plots are updated and if that includes the decrease in biomass, carbon density, biomass or carbon densities, then it's reflected on our analysis. But we don't have a per se. These are the carbon densities after the fire goes through those burned areas.
So I hear you, Anoop, saying that we don't have the carbon densities in an area post-fire.
We don't have those post-fire as designated as post-fire or prior fires, because FIA plot goes by their plot data sets every 5 to 10 years. And that's the reason, that's one of the reasons why we won't be able to say how much carbon density decreased after fire, say 2020 fire.
Is the analysis that you have, the data you have, spatial?
We have a spatial data on the land cover change from NLCD data. And the plot data is based on the FIA plots in state of Oregon.
Sorry, the FIA plot data is not spatial?
It's not. No, it's not spatial.
But it's based on. But you can take it down to sort of that forest type map that you were showing before. I mean, is it just one FIA piece of information for the whole state of Oregon, or are you able to get any more resolution?
So we got FIA data plots for different for the time periods it's available. So it's not available every year because it's updated every 5 years. Right. And we take that data and forest FIA plots are forest type group are by the forest type groups, and then we use the forest type groups. We overlay the forest type groups map on the NLCD map, and based on that, we assign the carbon density values for those forest type groups and get the total emission parameters.
So I don't want to take up too much of people's time. Maybe we can take this offline, but I have many questions, but I don't want to nerd out on the data, but I am not sort of unsatisfied about getting to the causes of the decline. And so maybe we can follow up with whoever's appropriate.
That's great.
So everybody else on this topic.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will say that we're in the middle of interpretation ourselves. And so, there's something that Odo could take on as far as taking the information and trying to apply it spatially. Not sure if we actually be able to do that in time for the final report for the inventory this winter, but certainly subsequent analyses could come out and help us understand the clearer picture.
Yeah, I mean, just to state the obvious, I mean, that's a huge, if you look at that table, that's a huge decline. And I think the report should have some analysis as to why that happened.
Yes,
anyway,
we will do our best.
Help with that, let me know.
Okay, great. Thank you for that offer. Okay, moving on. Representative Gamba, you mentioned that you would have a question. Did you want to state your question?
Now I'm unmuted. Similar to the last commissioner, I have lots and lots of questions, and some of them were similar to hers. So I won't re-ask those, but I would second the thought that having maybe put it in a different way, having a really good sense of behaviors, I guess, that are causing the trends we're seeing is what's going to be valuable in a policy, from a policy standpoint, right? If we know what are the things in specific, and I'll just, drained organic soils, right? So does that mean we're taking wetlands and developing? Does that mean we are, what are the behaviors that are driving these trends? Because those, I think, are where we're going to be able to put our thumb on the scale as far as making a change in those behaviors, but we need to know them. So it's a very similar question to, and then I have a more specific question that has to do with policy that I'm working on. So I guess my ask would be a piece of contact information so that I can reach out to you all to ask that that question separately from this.
Thank you. That sounds great. We can do that. And duly noted, absolutely attaching this information to behaviors is the next most important question. Specifically mentioning drained organic soils, we've gone through a lot of conversations with the team about drained organic soils and the likelihood that they were historic wetlands. We all know that wetlands have been battered in the state, and so there's opportunity there. And so we'll work with them to try and draw those relationships a little bit more clearly in the final report to the extent we can from this information, without like extrapolating too far and saying things that that we aren't quite sure about. We'll do that job.
Right, and just one other little detail, if it's possible. When you talk about developed lands, that's a very broad category, and there are many conversations politically that it would be useful to know what we're talking about. Are we talking about housing development? Are we talking about industrial lands? Are we talking about renewable energy, which is one of the arguments that's floating around out there, is that, oh, we're killing all this carbon sequestration of natural lands by putting up renewable energy. So it would be good to have that broken down too, a little more finitely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a similar thought too, like, with the organic soil contribution within the Willamette Valley, and then the current policy decision to, limit the development of, solar, utility scale solar within the Willamette Valley to protect soils. That might be very valid reasons, but yeah, thinking like, could agrivoltaics or some combination where we're looking at more than one use to maximize mitigation and sequestration.
Thank you for that. Olga, did you want to speak to what's included in developed lands very quickly?
Sure. Yeah. So it's based on the NLCD subclasses. There's 4 different ones: open space, low impact, medium impact, and high impact development. So there are more specific definitions of that, but it's based on the interpretation of remote sensing data and what kind of vegetation or lack thereof is visible from space. That is the best we can currently do in order to consistently define that type of land over the time series.
Thank you. And Commissioner Washetinsky, did you have, we hit on wetlands a little bit before, we hit on the drained organic soils. How are,
I don't have any additional questions.
Okay, great. and Senator Golden, I see that the Department of Forestry answered your practices question in the chat.
I
Are there
actually
any-
didn't see that. Should I take this offline with ODF?
It looks like they gave a pretty good answer. If you'd like to look there.
Yeah,
Do
they're
you have
probably,
additional questions?
it is their wheelhouse. No, I think I'll just talk to ODF about that. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. There any other questions for this project team today? Thank you for the excellent feedback and the direction you've given us for the final presentation and final report. It's very valuable.
Maybe just, I'm sorry, I said I didn't have any more questions. I do have a quick question. There's, as wood, the sequestration of harvested wood, like part of it's like what happens to the below soil carbon emissions and all that, but also part of it's like, well, how much is sequestered in a piece of furniture or the walls of a building or what have you. And I mentioned in the chat, and I don't know if it's appropriate here, but like, the assumption is at some point that timber, that wood is going to be trash and going to go to a landfill. There's not really a market, as far as I'm aware, for that wood waste. Is that part of this? Is seeing if there's ways to limit the contribution of wood waste to emissions, or is that sort of out of scope?
Out of scope for trying to figure out how we might reduce waste to landfills, but an absolute important question. And of course, DEQ started compiling a consumption-based inventory, which might really get to that as we move forward. If the project team wanted to speak to how landfill waste is being incorporated into this land-based net carbon inventory, that might be helpful. Just a really quick answer.
Well, so in the harvested wood product model, it looks at two pools. One is the products in use, like you said, the timber and construction materials and furniture and et cetera. And the second one is whatever is landfilled. So there's some decay that occurs, but whatever doesn't decompose just sits there. And so as more wood waste is added to the landfill, it sort of acts as a sink, essentially, because it just stores that carbon and locks it in. And that the amount of kind of carbon that's removed via landfill has been sort of more or less consistent across the time series. I don't know, probably whoever, folks from ODF that are on the call may add to that, or yeah, provide additional information if there's not a time to go in more detail.
Yeah, so I think your question, Commissioner, had two kind of points, and it was like, what are the mechanisms that we might reduce waste? And we haven't really answered that question, but Olga just briefly touched on that both the harvested wood product, like we're counting for that waste stream in a couple of places. So I hope that helps, and we can continue to answer your question offline, because I do think we have to move along, and the chair is nodding.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that presentation and the good questions that were asked. I think we're going to take a short break now, so maybe we can limit it to 5 minutes and come back at 11:20. That work for the rest of the agenda? That's okay. Great. Okay, people should be coming back. If you could just turn your video on just for a bit, so that we can see kind of a critical mass. Okay, I will turn it back to you, Liz, for our next agenda item.
Thank you. And I think actually Jason is going to introduce the next team. So next slide, please. And Jason, take it away.
Hello again. Turn the light on. Yeah, so just kind of flashing the slide again, since we just went through a lot of very dense and complicated data and methods here, to remind you all of where this work fits in alongside the inventory and the future work we're doing on the metrics and analysis. So right now we're focusing on the middle arrow, which is the Natural Climate Solutions Workforce Development and Training Program, which is sort of the other piece of, okay, so we know what's happening on the ground. Who do we get to actually implement the solutions that we're all kind of starting to talk about here? Next slide, please. And so the key message about this workforce work is, we can put together all of this data and information, but we can't do anything without the opportunities, the funding, and critically the people that are necessary to actually implement natural climate solutions and to increase carbon sequestration and storage within the land. And so you'll kind of see our workforce team talk with you a lot about the people who are involved in the work that's being done, but also the necessary opportunities and funding, including things like housing, training, and accessibility to actually doing the work. Next slide, please. And so the overall structure of how this is going to proceed, our project team will take over and talk first about the needs analysis relative to workforce demand and supply, then talk about findings from discussions with tribal nations and indigenous workforce. And then we are going to also take a look at who comprises the Natural Climate Solutions workforce and talk about some initial recommendations based on the work that we have already done. And actually, I think this slide should have been updated because I think one of the first things we're going to do is talk about who comprises the workforce and then go into the other information after that. So with that, I think I can hand it off to our project team. Cynthia, would you like to speak?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Before I get into my remarks, I just want to make sure that my team members have been promoted to panelists. So Rio and Andrew and Serena, just checking before I launch into things.
Yes, I'm here. Andrew's here.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Great.
No,
Thanks.
Rio's here. Yes. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good morning again, everyone. Chair McDonald, Climate Commission members. We're here today to provide you an update on our progress on the Natural Climate Solutions Workforce Development Study. My name is Cynthia Guzman, and I'm with Estelano Advisors. I'm joined by my colleague, Rio Morales, and our colleagues, Andrew Dyke from Echo Northwest and Serena Fasthorse from Kimimela Consulting, to give you an update on our findings. Next slide, please. So Jason just went through this. I'm going to provide a refresher on what this study seeks out to do, since I know it's been a while since we've addressed you all in this space. So a little bit of a refresher there, our methods for gathering information. We're also going to share some findings from our interviews of over 30 state agencies, contractors, workforce development providers, tribal nations, et cetera. We're also going to provide some key information about the size, composition, and characteristics of the NCS industry, and some of the recommendations that are emerging based on our findings. And we also invite questions from the audience here today. Next slide. So just a refresher on our primary research question for this effort. What are the workforce development and training needs needed to support the adoption of natural climate solutions on natural and working lands? In other words, we're thinking about the specific training, skills, education, and supports that are needed to prepare our labor force to meet the future job demands on these 5 working land types. We're also thinking about what are some of the, we're also thinking that while some skills and supports might be similar across different land types, we do anticipate some nuances with regards to the training needed. It's really important to note that this is really a first of its kind cross-sector industry study in the state of Oregon. And it asks a really big question, and we could easily spend the entirety of this project focused on one land type. However, we do see this as an initial scan aimed not just at identifying the needs, but also taking a step back to identify the scale and composition of this industry, which has not yet been done before in the state of Oregon. Next slide. Here are some of the sub-questions that we are looking into. First, we have to define what occupations fall under natural climate solutions. It's not a strictly defined sector, so we've had to do a fair amount of original analysis, as you'll hear shortly. Next, we're going to be also looking at programs that are doing exemplary training in this field. We're compiling a non-exhaustive list of training programs and doing profiles on each. We're looking at the composition of our workforce. And so you're going to hear some numbers in terms of the size of the workforce, employment numbers, earnings, and various demographic information. Lastly, based on all of this, we're going to ask ourselves the question, how robust is the sector? And for purposes of this study, we took a SWOT approach, which I'm sure is a framework many of you are familiar with: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We're using this frame to determine some of the challenges, needs, or gaps that may hinder the sector from helping to achieve the state's climate goals. And based on that, what actions should we take to ensure that the NCS workforce is equipped to do so? So we'll have some preliminary findings for you all today that will continue to shape through the end of this project. Next slide. So in thinking about natural climate solutions, I think it's most helpful to think about it in the context of a project. So if we're thinking about a coastal restoration project, what are the types of occupations involved in that project? Generally, we anticipate that some occupations would lead or support on the planning of the climate solution. So that's the square at the top of the slide there. That could range from land acquisition, design, permitting, etc. Concurrently or thereafter, we can assume that there will be occupations dedicated to the implementation of the solution. This is through the initial construction, conservation efforts, et cetera, et cetera. And lastly, once the solution is in place, we should ideally anticipate occupations dedicated to the maintenance of the solution. This is the ongoing stewardship piece to ensure that the project meets the objectives for which it is designed or restored. While some occupations may only do work in one of these project phases, there might be some other occupations like project managers that likely touch all 3. Next slide. Within this scheme, we see some opportunities for upskilling, particularly in the maintain and implement phase. And by that, I mean for workers to gather additional skills through formal training or an industry credential. For example, a forestry worker might make their way up to a crew lead or a project manager or some other type of technical position. We've also heard a lot about the importance of cross-training. We've heard anecdotally about how important it is for project managers or outside-facing staff to possess a broad understanding of various aspects of NCS work in order to guide a team or a project more effectively. This creates a more flexible, adaptable, and skilled workforce. Next slide. So ideally, a workforce ecosystem that allows folks to enter the workforce, provides opportunities for advancement and cross-training across different disciplines, can really facilitate this concept of adaptive management, which can result in better managed lands and in turn, better net carbon sequestration. Next slide. We're also doing a lot of thinking about ensuring that these jobs are quality jobs. And what do I mean by that? Our definition of quality jobs is informed by the Work of Jobs for the Future, which is a national workforce development think tank. Though our study here won't make recommendations across every element listed here, we do have insights on items like compensation and advancement, which we think are really really important for us to look at in order to make sure that folks that get into this industry are able to access the wages and supports that allow them to sustain themselves and their families and stay in the industry over time. Next slide. In an ideal world, we'll be able to talk about these occupations in this sector in the context of a transparent career pathway. So the one on the screen here is from the construction sector, and it clearly demonstrates how someone can enter the field, find the occupation that best speaks to their interests, and identify paid job training opportunities. They can also advance through the sector through a combination of on-the-job training experience and certifications, which can result in higher tenure and pay. A scheme like this should be available to job seekers in the NCS industry to understand the possibilities of their field. So before I go further, I would stop here and take a step back. I'm going to ask and invite Andrew from Echo Northwest to share on the composition of the workforce. Andrew, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. So I'm Andrew Dyke with Echo Northwest, and I and my colleagues have been leading the workforce assessment. What we're really trying to do is take a look at the workforce of the NCS sector. And what I'm going to show you is really just taking some very broad brush strokes to look at the key dimensions we're looking at. And the idea is to both sort of characterize the workforce's scope, scale, geographic distribution, as well as look at some dimensions like demographics, wage rates, et cetera, that help to start lay the groundwork for thinking about how the sector could be better supported in terms of worker recruitment, retention, and training. So we can go to the next slide here. So before getting into the data, and there's a lot of it, wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about our process, because as Cynthia mentioned, this is really a first for Oregon, the first time anyone has tried to characterize this particular workforce. If we were doing a construction assessment, the first steps gathering data would be pretty straightforward. There are well-defined construction industries. We can extract all that information and get to work analyzing. But the NCS sector has not been cleanly defined in the data that we use to inform the work, and so we went through a process, sort of described at a high level on this slide, to make sure that we define an industry that can rely on the data that we have access to, but that accurately captures and reflects the activities of NCS activities, whether from planning, implementing, all the way to maintaining. And so our first step was to identify a set of sub-industries in the data that looked like NCS industries, and then we went through an iterative process working with Odo and others to collect feedback on what belonged, what didn't belong, what we were missing, to first and foremost define the industry in concrete terms in a way that would be supported by the data. Then moved on from there to think about the occupations that are important to the industry, because this is a workforce assessment. What occupations are most common in the industry? What occupations are concentrated in the industry? Maybe there aren't very many of them, but they are very important to the NCS industry. And then went through another iterative process to make sure that we were capturing the important occupations according to people working in the field. So we solicited feedback from Odo and from many others, and that informed our final list. So with that in hand, we were able to take our definitions to the data and define the workforce along all the dimensions that we'll look at in a second. And ultimately, these findings, again, should support thinking about how best to support the workforce from a needs assessment perspective. We'll say one more thing before we get to the data. Well, a couple of things. One is that there are a lot of data on the next few slides. The report forthcoming will have all the same detail and more, so don't feel like you need to fully understand every number on the page. I want to describe what we're doing, and happy to take questions to the extent that there's time at the end, but we'll move through pretty quickly. Second is that we defined an NCS sector that does not necessarily identify employees who are directly involved necessarily in NCS in the solutions. For example, we include a lot of agricultural sectors. Some entities within those sectors will be implementing NCS, Others will not. Some may never, but the industry as we've defined it is really a potential NCS workforce. All of the entities could engage in the relevant activities. Okay, next slide. Okay, so first look, what does the industry look like? This slide shows the NCS industry as we've defined it. There are a number of sub-industries identified on the left of the chart. First thing to note is that there are sort of two sets of bars. There's a number at the top and then some very large bars at the bottom. And the bars at the bottom are industries that are important, critical to natural climate solutions, but are not specific. One of the best examples, I think, is trucking and transportation, where we can identify employment and employers in the trucking industry, but we can't determine very easily exactly what they're doing. A lot of truckers, most of them are not involved in natural climate solutions. So that's an example of a less specific industry. The generally shorter bars at the top are what we would call more specific or specific NCS industries. And those are industries that encompass employers, employees, self-employed individuals that are at least potentially very directly involved in NCS. If you add up that top set, we end up with a count of industry employment of about 69,000. If you were to add in all of the less specific industries employment, you get to a total of about 125,000. The truth is somewhere in the middle, probably. Another dimension here, we show employment by sector. The orange bars are private sector employees. There are so-called non-employer establishments, which account for self-employed individuals and sole proprietorships, et cetera. And then we also can identify local, state, and federal government employee. And it's, I think, pretty clear where the public sector employment is concentrated in this slide. Next slide, please. Where does the industry exist across the state? This map shows you not where the most numbers are, but where does the NCS industry account for the largest or smallest share of the local or regional workforce. Pretty clearly, Eastern Oregon, we see the largest concentration of the, in a relative sense, of the NCS workforce. Much less so in the Portland metro region, Mid-Willamette Valley, although those regions account for a much larger share of the total employment, but the NCS sector is less important to the overall workforce. Next slide. So that was a picture of the industry, a couple of different dimensions. Again, more information in the report. This slide starts to break that employment out by occupation. You can see a large number of occupations in very small fonts on the left of the chart. These are derived from that process, that iterative process I mentioned, where we first sought to identify the most numerous, the most concentrated occupations, and then filled in the gaps with occupations that the field sees as important. A couple of interesting features here, sort of mirroring the industry chart. The longest bar is that tractor trailer truck drivers. Again, as an industry and as an occupation, it is not specific to NCS. Where you see large yellow bars, those are occupations where there are other industries competing for workers with NCS, which has some workforce implications. The chart's also showing, again, sort of private sector employment in dark green, self-employment in lighter green, and then government in the orange. Okay, next slide. A couple of slides here on wages. I think by occupation, the fact that some occupations have higher wages than others is probably not particularly surprising, but I think this kind of information gives you the range of occupations important to the industry and the relative wage levels, which speaks to what Cynthia was describing as potential progressions through the industry. We might need, if we want to attract people into the workforce, a lot of them will be doing more entry-level jobs at the lower end of the pay scale. But from a workforce development perspective, it's important to make sure that there are clear pathways that those individuals see to potentially more highly paid occupations as they progress. And we can move on to the next slide. Thinking about that entry level, we have here a similar chart, but what we're looking at here is not the typical wages, but our best proxy for entry level wages. We don't have good data on what first-time employees actually earn, but we can see the 10th percentile wage. OED publishes these for each occupation, and that gives us a sense of what an entry-level wage is likely to be by occupation. The spread on the chart shows you regional variation in that entry-level wage. On the left, you see the 10th percentile wage in the workforce region of the state with the lowest 10th percentile wage. Obviously, on the right, you're looking at the 10th percentile wage for the region that has the highest. For the most part, the higher proxy for entry-level wages are in more urban areas. The lower end are in more rural areas. There are, of course, differences in costs of living across those two regions. But here also we see, I think, some implications for attraction and recruitment, particularly of younger workers in different regions of the state and into different occupations that might be more or less prevalent in urban versus rural areas. Okay, next slide, please. So a couple more characteristics of the workers themselves. This slide shows you the educational attainment of workers who identify as being in the NCS industry, some different data sets here. A couple of findings that I think are useful and important. One is that if we aggregate across the workers in the industry, by and large, the industry has a somewhat higher share of workers with a high school diploma or less compared to the statewide average, and those figures are shown at the bottom of the chart there. At the same time, at the top end of the educational attainment spectrum, the industry and Oregon overall have a similar share of workers that have a bachelor's degree or better, speaking to the highly technical nature of many of the occupations that are important to planning, implementing, and even maintaining NCS solutions. Quite a bit of variation across different types of occupations, probably in many not surprising ways, but I think it's important to think about that variation, again, in the context of recruitment, retention, and potential barriers to access to jobs in the industry. Next slide. Another demographic we looked at is age. Again, at the bottom, you see the Oregon overall age distribution and the industry overall age distribution. Not quite as dramatic a difference there, but we do see a slightly higher share of older workers in the NCS industry as we've defined it, slightly lower share of younger workers, and you can see quite a bit of variation in that age distribution across specific occupations. A lot of factors go into that age distribution. For example, some relatively young looking occupations like tree trimmers and pruners might have more younger workers simply because of the physical nature of the work, where it's much easier to do the physical work if you're younger. Other reasons for variation in age might have to do with the training pathways into the occupation, where if a PhD is required for a scientific position, it's going to be hard to find very young workers because it takes time to get trained, although those younger workers could be exposed to the industry in more entry-level positions. Same time, we see some occupations like farmers with compared to the state, relatively high share of older workers, older owners, due to a lot of factors. When we're at risk of having a lot of individuals aging out of a workforce, there's a risk of loss of institutional knowledge. And so depending on where an occupation falls with this age distribution, there are different workforce implications moving forward. Okay, next slide. Characteristic more of the work itself than the workers, but we did look at seasonality in employment across the industry and industry sectors for each of the three phases that Cynthia defined: the plan, the maintain, the implement. Across the board, employment is relatively seasonal in these industries, with peaks depending on the weather conditions and typical operational cycles for the industry. And we do see a difference across the sectors. And the slides disappeared here, so I don't know if other people are still seeing those. Thank you. We do see a somewhat different, higher level of seasonality in a relative and absolute sense for the implement and maintain phases, probably not too surprising. Also important to recognize there's a lot of overlap in the activities. Many entities that are operating to plan and design NCS will also work to maintain and or implement build. But regardless, there are also important workforce implications here. For employers having to deal with wide swings in employment, how to retain experienced workers in spite of these swings, et cetera. Okay, next slide. So just to close the data presentation with a couple more slides. This is back to demographics of the workers. Here we're looking at the share by occupation of workers that identify as female or that identify as BIPOC. As with the other charts, some pretty big variation across the occupations, some of which are systematically related to the type of work, the compensation of the work. But we see this kind of information as useful for thinking about where we might invest in efforts to diversify a workforce that does not appear very diverse by gender or by race and ethnicity, as a way to broaden the pool of potential workers, in addition to encouraging diversity in and of itself. Next slide. So finally here, a look at wage differentials by occupation and by race and ethnicity. You're looking at a couple different things here. One, the length of the bar to the left or to the right shows the difference of the occupational wage relative to the overall Oregon median. So is this an occupation that is relatively more paid relatively well or less well compared to the median? Bars to the left are lower paid, bars to the right are higher paid. Within the occupations, we're also showing wages by race and ethnicity, and it's not very disaggregated, partly due to the nature of the data, also due to time here. We show the median wages for white workers in each occupation and for BIPOC workers. And again, I think this kind of information speaks to the need to think about both pathways through the industry, whether it's within an occupation or across occupations, as well as potential barriers to access and progression faced by particular groups. And from a workforce development perspective, identifying and removing those barriers support not just the individuals, but also the industry as a whole, particularly in a context of a ultimately shrinking labor force as the society ages. Okay, next slide. Oops, I think other way. Oops, I think we're going backwards here. Just going to wrap up here. Again, broad brushstrokes, a lot more detail will be forthcoming in the report. By and large, I think it's critical to recognize this is a first of its kind effort. The industry is not well defined in the existing data, but it is possible to coherently describe the industry and workforce with the available data. A lot of overlap in terms of activities of different employers and individuals spanning the phases that Cynthia mentioned. Didn't show it here, but we do see that this industry as defined has been growing over time. And also that there are some ongoing challenges, some of which are specific more or less to the industry, but also some of which are more general, such as access to effective training, an aging workforce, et cetera, all of which feeds into thinking about what the workforce needs to be better supported. With that, I believe I will turn it over to Rahi from Estelano Advisors.
My name is Brio. I'll be speaking in this portion today. So hello, I'm with Estelano. I will walk us through a taste of our qualitative needs analysis findings. These complement ECHO's quantitative assessment. And on this slide, we wanted to first highlight some overarching findings across the needs analysis. These are gleaned from 32 one-on-one interviews we've conducted with workforce and tribal partners over the last few months. First, highlighting strengths. This sector is expanding, it's growing. There are many related jobs that are projected to remain in high demand. Growth is creating more opportunities for youth employment and entry-level pathways, as well as increased demand for skilled workers in federal, tribal, state, and local government roles, and for workers that will be managing, for roles that will be managing NCS projects. But significant barriers remain, including limited community infrastructure to support job seekers, particularly in rural areas of Oregon where many projects are occurring. Deep gaps in affordable housing, childcare, and transportation and food insecurity hinder workforce stability, and many jobs lack living wages and sustainable benefits, which makes long-term retention difficult. There is growing interest among young people who are interested in entering NCS careers. That's a real opportunity. And there's opportunities there to build more clear career ladders in areas like project management, in technical specialization, and in restoration leadership. But in a more existential way, in NCS fields, public funding is the primary driver of the sector, and the way those funds are designed and distributed directly shapes the workforce conditions on the ground. So inconsistent federal funding, federal immigration enforcement for a largely immigrant workforce is further disrupting opportunities to plan for what this workforce needs. We can go to the next slide. Our findings really focus on two essential elements of workforce development. You'll see this is how we organize our presentation today. On one side, we have workforce demand, which is understanding what skills are needed and what funding drives workforce demand. And in supply, that's ensuring that there's a well-trained and available workforce to meet those needs. In an effective system, training and funding work in balance, creating both the capacity to complete critical projects and a workforce that's ready to deliver them. The following slides are going to highlight the key frictions that we've identified between workforce demand and supply, and opportunities that we've uncovered and that our interviewees have also suggested to better align those. We can go to the next slide to start that. So on the demand, on the funding and procurement side, low bid contracts are driving down wages and job quality. Focusing on barriers and gaps here, these contracting practices don't account for the full cost of NCS jobs, which include project management roles, specialized training. In addition, one-year grant funding cycles make long-term workforce planning burdensome and expensive for tribal nations, for schools, nonprofits, and other training providers. We heard from one tribal nation interviewee that described managing 29 separate grants out of a single office, and this requires significant administration. Another interviewee, a forestry contractor, noted that their contracts tend to be no longer than 1 year in length, and that requires a lot of work, a huge administrative burden to rebid year after year, which is not always the model for public contracts. There are opportunities to model and standardize effective procurement practices that are currently being used in a few jurisdictions, and to make those longer term and streamlined practices the norm rather than the exception. Jump to the next slide, and we start looking at supply. In recruitment and hiring, a lot of NCS work occurs in remote regions and rural areas. And these are places where our communities already face limited access to training programs and higher education. So jobs that don't require degrees are viewed as low skill or seasonal, which makes recruitment and retention challenging. Across Oregon, entry-level NCS wages often fall short of rising housing costs, and affordable housing across the state remains a major barrier, but especially in rural and in the coastal areas. A lot of jobs require reliable transportation to remote sites. NCS jobs tend to be spread out geographically, but access to driver education and DMV services and public transit are especially limited in rural and tribal communities. Despite these challenges, there are strong opportunities for success here. The aging workforce in agriculture and forestry highlights the need for youth engagement. When workers, particularly young people, have access to training programs and supportive services like childcare and transportation, they can thrive. And young people are attracted to the purpose-driven and hands-on nature of the work. It's very exciting to them. So programs with early career exposure are very popular right now. We spoke to a counselor at a rural Southern Oregon high school who shared that their NCS-related CTE program consistently has a wait list, and students are showing up every day and fully engaged in the work, especially for their summer program. And that strong interest and participation highlights a lot of potential growth when access barriers are removed. We can go to the next slide. So these findings address the programs and skills that are necessary for successful NCS implementation training. There is a strong need for training pathways in NCS careers, particularly for jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. Farm service providers, like soil and water conservation districts, are key to NCS implementation on working lands, but they require upskilling. People in these roles need upskilling to stay up to date on the newest strategies and to effectively engage with producers. We've also found project management, and the project manager role is a highly transferable and demand skill. it's transferable to all these different sectors and land types and job types, but it requires exposure to those different types. So that exposure is something that small contractors often struggle to provide for their employees. Unpaid and low-paid field work remains a common factor for most workers entering this sector, which creates financial barriers that limit access for diverse workers. Some employers are exploring paid internship programs to support access to hands-on experience in youth in particular. We keep coming back to youth in this study, but there's so much opportunity here, and they in particular need these supports. Food security is a major issue for young people, like that high school program we mentioned. Like teachers have self-funded a community fridge for summer youth conservation crews, so that it's a basic barrier, just being able to have a hot and fresh lunch. Public sector employment in NCS, especially federal and state jobs, they typically have higher wages, better health benefits, financial stability for rural workers especially, but the hiring requirements are a major barrier into those jobs. A major opportunity that we've seen today is recognizing conservation training in public sector hiring policies that can help job seekers have an advantage. So similar to pathways that we've seen in the construction sector. For example, the Federal Pathways Program, graduates of the Youth Conservation Corps and similar programs like that can be credited with up to 2 years of job experience, which gives them an advantage in the labor market. We can go to the next slide. In retention and advancement, high turnover is a major issue. So strained working conditions, seasonality, low pay, that leads a lot of field crew workers to leave within a year. Pay is the major reason why workers leave one job for another. No surprise there. But organizations that have increased pay have seen immediate retention improvements. We heard that from contractors. We heard that from soil and water conservation districts. In a lot of these positions with limited advancement pathways, rural employers report that biologists, wetland scientists, and foresters, those scientific positions, they often relocate to urban areas after a year or two in order to advance their careers because there aren't pathways in the rural organizations. Workers without degrees hit a ceiling at crew lead or foreman roles because of few opportunities for project lead or management roles. And then minimal credentialing in NCS skills for restoration crews and for farm workers also makes it difficult to recognize those workers' transferable skills so that they can advance even at other employers. So to address these barriers, some contractors use skill-based pay structures. That's something we want to lift up with offering certifications in areas like chainsaw operation or plant identification that can lead to tiered pay increases and can be a recognized skill. Other contractors cross-train their crews with as wildland firefighters, and that helps expand some off-season job opportunities. And then to address wage disparities, just an example, the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts is conducting a statewide compensation survey to help districts adjust their budgets to align around pay across regions and for parity across regions. That's just one example of kind of successes we've heard among especially nonprofits in doing the pay and compensation assessments. I'm going to pass it along to my colleague Serena Fasthorse of Kamimila Consulting. She'll share findings from tribal nation and tribal related interviews specifically.
Mitakiapi, Petuashte, good day everyone. My name is Serena Fasthorse. I am with Kamimila Consulting and I specialize in tribal and indigenous community engagement, and so I was brought in on this project to ensure that tribal voices were integrated throughout the study. And I know that we're getting close to our time, and in respect for everybody's time, I'm going to try to zoom through my slides a little bit, and a lot of them complement what's been said already. But this is these are some of the preliminary findings from the interviews that I've been having with tribal nations and intertribal organizations. So some main messages and general themes are here on this slide. The first one is that weaving indigenous traditional ecological and cultural knowledge, also known as ITEC, with Western science is key to developing holistic natural climate solutions. There are a lot of places and spaces that still do not recognize and value iTech as valid science, and with the way that it's been developed by tribal nations, indigenous peoples for thousands of years with on their relationship with the land. It's a great place to start when we're thinking about returning to natural solutions and healing our climate problems. Secondly, cultural resources are natural resources, or natural resources or cultural resources. It goes both ways, but really that the protection and cultivation of first foods is top priority for tribes and indigenous communities. So all of this natural climate solution work that tribes are doing, yes, it is for decreasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and helping with our climate problems. It's also about protecting those cultural resources and that connection to land and space and first foods that makes tribal people who they are and able to practice their culture. The third point here is that colonization has drastically changed the character of the Willamette Valley, not only the landscapes, but the waterscapes too. And so looking at land care through a lens of decolonization and indigenization will help to heal the harm that colonization and settlement have caused. And so that's a great place to start. Next slide, please. Also, just looking at some of the specific challenges and barriers that tribal communities face, both on the employee side and the employer side. It does echo a lot of what Rio shared already, but a lot of these challenges can be exacerbated by the historical marginalization and disenfranchisement that tribal communities experience. And so, some of these are the transportation access, having access to a vehicle or a way to get to work. But not only that, but getting a driver's license in the first place is something that we've heard from tribal specific workforce development crews. Lots of folks don't have the means to learn how to drive. Their family doesn't have a vehicle, they don't have a driver's license, and so helping them get that is a huge first step to opening pathways to employment. Housing insecurity across the board, affordability and availability of housing. Food insecurity, that is something that came up a lot in the workforce development interviews that I have been a part of, where especially when working with indigenous communities, sometimes crew members won't have the means to bring a lunch or eat breakfast or have a meal that day, and so that can impact their ability to work well and safely. And so one of the workforce development programs that we talk to, they will literally make sure that folks have something to eat and are not working on an empty stomach when they come to work, especially when they're out there with like in the forest with chainsaws and things. It's very important to be well nourished. Childcare access and availability, affordability, high poverty rates will have effects on all of these things and more, and it can lead to judgment and discrimination in hiring processes, and even after someone has a job, can make folks seem irresponsible or unintelligent when really it's just the means that they have. Another example is like folks are not sure about the financial systems, like they don't have a bank account yet and might need some help understanding that system. And then finally, of course, education levels will influence opportunities available to individuals, and being able to gain higher education can be a barrier too. And then on the employer side, pay, benefit, competitiveness, touched on by Rio a little bit, but a lot of tribes and intertribal organizations are running off of grants, and so there are short-term grant cycles, and that is not compatible with these long-term goals of attending to land and healing land and running these programs that support long-term careers. And so oftentimes it's hard for them to compete when they're on these grant cycles. Office space and housing availability tends to be an issue too. Where to put people when they are hired, and then like talking with folks who live on the coast or in rural areas, sometimes they'll be trying to hire someone from out of state, and then they won't be able to find anywhere for them to live when they come. So some of those challenges there, and then we can go on to the next slide, which is my last slide. It just talks about some potential actions that can be taken to respond to some of these challenges that we're hearing from Indian country. The first one is just to think about tribal nations as partners. Tribal nations and intertribal organizations are often the leading employers in their sectors or in their geographical area. Lots of tribes employ hundreds, if not thousands, of employees. And these can range from entry-level positions to, higher level positions. And yeah, so it's a great opportunity to think of them as partners and these large employers. And then supporting the development and growth of local training programs. There's a need for different pathways to getting into these careers, not just the higher education pathway, but thinking about experiential education and those pathways for youth. That makes it easy to envision themselves and obtain these kinds of careers. Also, investing in programs that fund tribal-led natural climate solutions. So this could include tribal research, restoration efforts. Also, there was a call out from a tribe about the tribal higher education, supporting that through the Oregon Opportunity Grant. And they said that it has increased the amount of students that are continuing into higher education and obtaining degrees. And so that opens up many pathways too. But yeah, the tribal research piece is huge too, and thinking about what these solutions are going to look like on the ground, and offering the opportunity for folks to experiment with Indigenous traditional knowledge, because even though we have this, traditional knowledge and there's a lot of wealth there, we're also in a new era, and so we're wanting to create some modern solutions to our modern problems. And so how does Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge weave together to become more powerful and help us in this time? So thinking about those things, the different investments that can be made. And then finally, prioritizing policies that promote habitat protection and restoration. Lots of tribes talk about the power of cultural burning and the benefits there for the soil and the habitats, healthier greenery. Waterways are really important too, thinking about how all of these plants can survive without water is impossible to do. So the healthy waterways are important too. And then, of course, protecting first foods, because for the bottom line for tribes are those things that make us who we are, and our ability to practice our culture. So I will probably have to leave pretty soon. I don't know if I can stay for questions or if there will be questions, but I'm happy to connect with anybody who would like to learn more about these pieces. Thank you. And I'll pass it back to Cynthia.
Thanks, Serena. If we can go to the next slide, please, I will bring us home. So our report will culminate with a series of recommendations. In those written recommendations, we propose breaking them up into the 3 categories that Rio established earlier in his remarks: contracting and procurement. These are going to be the actions that the state, not just Odo, but all agencies involved in carbon sequestration work and involved in promoting economic development and jobs, can take within their power of purchasing and contracting to promote quality NCS jobs. So essentially, how can we influence policies and practices to grow a stronger workforce? The following two areas deal with the supply of workers. What are some interventions that we could support or encourage in the workforce development ecosystem to help support the existing supply of workers at key junctures during a job seeker's work experience, so to speak, during the recruitment phase, the hiring phase, training, advancement. Another thing I want to emphasize before I go into the following slides, these recommendations are intended to serve as a platform or a roadmap for ongoing collaboration between Odo and agencies involved in this work, but not exclusively. As we've established earlier in our remarks, a functioning workforce ecosystem requires collaboration between training providers, contractors, educational institutions, the public sector, labor, tribes, etc. And this is the level of specificity that we hope to achieve for the recommendations in the final report. Next slide. In the interest of time, I will focus only on a few things. For contracting and procurement, one of our primary recommendations is around taking a regional approach to funding and planning for NCS investments and projects. We recommend that public agencies explore bundling multiple NCS projects into a single contract. This will not only help achieve benefits like cost savings and streamlined delivery, but also help contractors keep crews reliably employed over longer periods of time, thereby addressing some of the seasonality challenges that are pervasive in natural and working lands work, but also on the administrative end too. You heard Rio talk about the burden that are on a lot of these contractors in managing multiple contracts over short periods of time. Second, we recommend that the state develop standard contract languages that emphasizes best practices for hiring, training, and developing NCS workers. This includes things like encouraging lower hiring barriers for all entry-level positions, allowing new hires to attain credentials like CPR certification or a driver's license within 90 days, discouraging the practice of unpaid internships and volunteer labor for NCS implementation, and exploring a wider use of community workforce agreements to implement labor standards on contracts above a certain size and scale. Next slide. For recruitment and hiring, we do see things like transportation, housing, childcare. That is a major pervasive barrier for NCS workers. So we really recommend that the state continue to support housing, transportation, and childcare solutions for workers, particularly in rural parts of the state and areas, tribal parts of the state as well. So encouraging leveraging existing systems and programs to increase supportive services near job sites, formalizing partnerships with childcare experts to co-plan and invest in solutions, similar with housing experts to identify and co-locate housing solutions near job locations, particularly in rural areas of the state where there's an anticipated increase in NCS-related investments. And then coordinating with DMV or other to co-locate driver education and testing facilities near workforce development centers, community colleges, libraries, and other public serving institutions to really kind of bring down this barrier that is a problem, an ongoing problem for young folks trying to enter the workforce. Next slide. We don't want to recreate the wheel by, recommending entirely new programs or offerings. We really recommend building upon the ingenuity of existing NCS programs, expanding regional training opportunities across state, federal, and local projects. This means continuing to support programs that expose youth to the conservation work to help continue to build interest in the field, continuing to promote relationships between employers and NCS degree programs at community colleges and universities to ensure that students gain the in-demand skills and practical experience they need to be on the job. Also explore the possibility of a higher education coordinating commission sector strategy related to NCS careers. And also support ongoing education opportunities for workers on restoration crews to advance to project management, planning, or other technical roles. Another recommendation that we have here is around deploying a public sector cross-agency rotating fellows program for early career workers to gain NCS-related experience across various land types. One of the things that we heard from many contractors is just the importance of that project manager being a bit of a jack of all trades, and you typically get that jack of all trades kind of knowledge through time by just putting in time in a longer tenure. This cross-agency rotating fellows program is intended to fast track that a bit by exposing project management employee, or even think about maybe a forestry employee, someone that's out in the field, and exposing them to multiple agencies and how things are done across multiple public agencies to build that expertise earlier, and create someone that is then in turn able to more functionally, effectively identify solutions and connect dots on problems that are happening, issues that arise in the field, which could be really valuable. Okay, and I believe that is my last slide. Yes. Thank you all for your time and attention. I know that went a little longer than we had hoped, but have a lot of chock full of information here. So happy to take questions at this time. We have some open-ended questions in the next slide, Liz, if you want to go to that, or if you want to stay here, that's okay too. Thank you.
We will stay here. Yeah,
great.
Thank you very much for the great presentation and the work. I don't know that we have much time for questions. Jeff, do we have any public comment first?
Chair, we do not. There's no one signed up at the team.
Okay.
Who is on the call?
So we probably have a few minutes for questions then.
Senator Golden has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I do have a specific question, but others too. And I wonder if there is contact information for a point person if we want to drill down on something in particular.
Yes, sure. I mean, happy to connect with you, Senator Golden, as the project manager for the project, and also can then work to get in touch with who we might need to get you in touch with from the project team.
We can be sent your contact info?
Yes.
Well, I do have a question, but I'll defer because I think I can take it offline. But it regards the forest support segment in NCS and whether that's broken down because different jobs would have such different implications for carbon.
Okay, yes, we'll do that because I know too that Echo Northwest has worked deeply in the forestry sector with workforce jobs. So we'll follow up with you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Thornback has his hand up.
Right.
Yeah, we've got Southern Oregon ganging up here on you, but I ask it in the chat too. It's just this study, just like what the impact of the federal cuts. I'm very familiar with both some of the NGOs down here and some of the for-profit folks doing forest work, and between the federal cuts, withholding of funds, the immigration enforcement that was mentioned. I mean, it's a disaster. And that just can't possibly have good implications for workforce development when people see that kind of development happening. It just is, it just is, couldn't have been predicted necessarily, but it's just so destabilizing, I think. And maybe just some kind of comment as to how to deal with that, or how to deal with that in terms of policy recommendations and just for the outcome of the study itself. Thanks.
Yes, that is what you're naming there is something that was hanging over pretty much every conversation that we had with contractors that primarily employ a Latino workforce. So with regards to the federal immigration enforcement, but just contractors in general, there was a sense of uncertainty and frankly fear about keeping crews hired for longer periods of time, opting to keep smaller crews, kind of take a more conservative approach because of the lack of certainty of ongoing funding. A lot of these challenges immigration enforcement kind of go beyond the scope of our study, but I will say that offering some level of certainty from what we do know, which is this, projects that we know are planned and funded and in the project pipeline at the regional and state scale, I think might be a very interesting exercise for the state to do, to provide contractors and the workforce development community some sense of certainty that there will be some level of work that's coming out the door over the next couple of years. I think folks are looking for that sense of certainty and don't necessarily have that. So within the realm of what we can control, which is I think a lot of the funding that is coming, that we know has been committed and we have some certainty is coming out at the state level, I think would go a long way to provide a little bit of certainty, not complete certainty, but at least some certainty around demand, which could then in turn help inform some of the hiring decisions that are happening on the contractor side, but also some of the training decisions that are happening on the workforce development side, because the last thing all these folks want to do is train folks for jobs that may not materialize at the end of 6 months or 8 months. So that is certainly something that we're holding. And Liz, you may want to speak more to this, but our report deliberately does not include a demand study, which is kind of a 5 to 10 year projection of the projects that we can anticipate come down the pipeline. That is typically something that's included in our workforce assessments, but given everything that's been going on, that is not something that we took into account as part of this.
Right. It does seem like that's an important aspect, though, in terms of
it is.
And maybe it's just scaling, even just the reality of scaling down some of that demand, at least for whatever time frame, seems like a realistic time frame. But I'm thinking of, any restoration work. A huge chunk of Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board funding is Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery funding, which has always been uncertain every biennium. It's probably more uncertain now. So it's just raises such a level of kind of, I don't know, despair, I suppose.
Sure.
Or something, but
yeah.
I think we have an option after the commission is able to accept or establish a large goal. Funding, doing a demand study based on the funding at hand or coming down the pike may not be doable because it's so up and down. However, perhaps putting together some sort of demand study based on the overarching goal and working backwards from there. Like, how many workers would we need to reach this overarching carbon sequestration and storage goal is something that we could consider doing with funding ourselves. So.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I don't see any other hands up. Then we can go to the last slide. I'm assuming we have a next step slide. There we go. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that at our October meeting, we talked about the transformational integrated greenhouse gas project. And we received some public comments and staff have responded to those comments. And those are, I believe, posted on our meeting page. Is that correct? Am I getting that right, Chuck?
That is correct. It's on the November 14 meeting page.
Great. So you can find those comments there. Next month, we're going to be hearing about these two projects again. So if you didn't catch everything the first time, you'll get more familiar with it next month. We're also going to talk about transportation. And then in January, we'll start to kick off the phase 2 of the Tigger project that I just mentioned. And we'll hear the presentations on these two topics as well as on transmission. Probably need to come back to transportation and transmission a couple times. So that we might just get started on transmission, as it is such a big deal. But we'll be looking ahead for the rest of the year to start to think about developing our biennial report and making sure that our meetings are supporting work towards that end. So that's what we've got looking ahead. And with that, I will close the November 14th meeting of the Oregon Climate Action Commission. Thanks for everybody's participation today.